A woman stepped off the train into a town that didn't want her, carrying a suitcase held shut with rope and a name nobody could pronounce right. The sheriff who hired her hadn't spoken more than 40 words to a living person in 3 years. The winter coming was the worst in 40 years. And somewhere between frozen pipes, a town that whispered too loud, and a blizzard that nearly killed them both, something impossible happened. This is not a love story. Not exactly. It's a survival story, and it starts with a wanted nobody expected anyone to answer. Hit that like button, drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The train was 40 minutes late, which meant the small crowd waiting on the platform at Red Hollow had 40 extra minutes to reconsider the wisdom of being outside in the first place. It was the kind of cold that didn't announce itself gradually. It arrived all at once, the way a door slams. Not slowly creaking open, but sudden, final, done. The temperature had dropped 14 degrees since morning, and the sky above the Bitterroot Range had turned the flat, seamless gray of old pewter. No clouds exactly, just sky that had decided to withhold everything: sun, color, warmth, and offer nothing in return but wind. Sheriff Cole Mercer stood at the far end of the platform, away from the three other people waiting for the southbound connection. He had his hands in his coat pockets and his hat pulled low enough that only the bottom half of his face was visible, jaw set, lips pressed together in the way people hold their expressions when they're trying not to feel the temperature. He was 41 years old. He had the kind of face that looked like it had been through a few things and hadn't particularly enjoyed most of them. Not ugly, just settled, like a piece of land that's been through drought and flood and still grows something, but nobody would call it pretty. He was there to meet a stranger. The ad had been his deputy Harlan's idea, technically. Cole had resisted it for 2 weeks, then finally given in during the first hard freeze when he came home to a house where the kitchen pipe had burst and flooded half the floor, and he'd stood in the doorway for a full 5 minutes just staring at the water spreading across the boards. And something in him, some last stubborn wall, had simply given out. Help wanted, the ad had read in the Territorial Gazette. Sheriff's household, Red Hollow, Montana. General domestic work through winter season. Room and board provided. Inquire by letter to C. Mercer, Red Hollow County Sheriff's Office. Simple enough. Businesslike. Nothing in it to suggest anything complicated. He'd gotten 7 responses. 6 he'd discarded without much thought. Too young, too far. 1 letter that smelled like whiskey and contained spelling that concerned him professionally. The 7th was from a woman named Elena Novak, writing from Billings, where she'd been working in a boarding house laundry for the past 8 months. Her letter was 3 paragraphs, precise and unornamented. I am a hard worker, she'd written. I do not require much. I understand winter. I will not complain about the cold or the isolation if the situation is honest and the arrangement is clearly defined. I have references if needed. No flattery, no charm. Just, here's what I am, here's what I need. Tell me if it works. He'd written back the same day. The train arrived at 4:22 in the afternoon, which in November in Montana meant it arrived in near darkness. The platform lights, 2 oil lanterns hung from poles, did very little against the dusk. Cole watched the passenger car doors open, watched the small shuffle of people descending. A traveling merchant with sample cases, a young couple with a baby who was screaming in absolute outrage at the cold, an older man in a minister's collar. And then Elena Novak. She came down the steps carefully, which was the first thing he noticed. Not slowly, not timidly, but carefully. Like someone who had learned the hard way that ice doesn't care who you are. She had a suitcase in her right hand, a canvas bag over her left shoulder, and she was wearing a dark wool coat that had probably been good quality once, maybe 8 years ago. The collar was turned up. Her dark hair was pinned back under a hat that was functional rather than fashionable. She was somewhere in her early 30s, though she had the kind of face that could have been older or younger, depending on the light. She stepped onto the platform, set her suitcase down on the boards, and looked around. Not anxiously. She wasn't scanning the crowd with that desperate need to find my person energy. She looked around the way you look at a new place when you're trying to understand it before it understands you. Her eyes found him. He wasn't hard to spot. He was the only one wearing a badge. She picked up her suitcase and walked toward him at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow. Sheriff Mercer, she said. It wasn't quite a question. Miss Novak, he touched the brim of his hat. Train's late. Yes. She didn't apologize for it. It wasn't her train. He looked at her luggage, the suitcase, the canvas bag. That was everything. He'd seen people move into hotel rooms with more than that. That's all you have? That's all I need, she said. He couldn't tell if that was confidence or just practicality, and he wasn't sure it mattered. He reached for the suitcase. She didn't argue about it, which he appreciated. He'd met women who made a whole performance out of refusing help, and he didn't have the patience for theater. Wagon's out front, he said. It's 20 minutes to the house. Cold ride. I assumed, she said. They walked off the platform without further conversation. The town of Red Hollow existed because of the river and the cattle trade and the particular stubbornness of the 230 people who had decided at various points in the past 15 years that this was the place they were going to stop moving. It wasn't picturesque. There were better towns in Montana. There were prettier valleys, broader streets, finer buildings. Red Hollow had a main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, a doctor's office, a barber shop, a small hotel, and the county sheriff's office, which was also the jail, which was a one-story building that leaned slightly to the left in a way that had never been explained. It had roughly the charm of a man who's been working outside all day. Functional, honest, a little rough around the edges, not particularly interested in your opinion. As the wagon moved through the main street toward the edge of town, Elena looked at it all without comment. A few people on the boardwalk looked back. Word traveled fast in small towns, and the word about the sheriff's new hired help had been traveling for 3 days already, ever since Harlan's wife Agnes had seen the return letter and told her sister, who told the woman who ran the general store, who told approximately everyone else. Cole felt the looks without seeing them. He'd been the town sheriff for 11 years. He knew the exact frequency of Red Hollow gossip. It was constant, low-grade, and largely harmless, like background noise you stopped hearing after a while. Or tried to. Elena didn't seem bothered by the stares. She looked at the town with the same careful attention she'd used on the platform, taking stock, not seeking approval. How long have you been sheriff? She asked, once they'd cleared the main street. 11 years. And before that? He glanced at her sideways. Most people didn't ask follow-up questions. Army. Before that, cattle work. Where are you from originally? Tennessee, long time ago? She nodded. Didn't volunteer anything in return. He found that he didn't mind. The road out to the house ran through a half-mile of open ground before the land rose slightly toward a ridge where a stand of pines offered some windbreak. The house sat at the base of that ridge, a solid 2-story structure that had been built to last rather than to impress. Barn to the left, woodshed, a small outbuilding that had once been a smokehouse. The yard between them was deep in snow, broken only by Cole's tracks from the morning. He stopped the wagon near the front porch and climbed down. Elena looked at the house for a moment, just looked. He couldn't read what she was thinking. It's bigger than I expected, she said finally. 2 people lived here before, just me now. He said it without particular emotion, the way you state a fact about the weather. She didn't press it. Inside, the house was what it was. Clean enough, functional, and absolutely without warmth in every sense except the technical one. Cole had kept a fire going in the main room, so the temperature was survivable, but the house felt the way houses feel when only one person has been living in them for a long time. Like the rooms had stopped trying. Furniture in sensible places, nothing decorative, nothing unnecessary. A kitchen that showed evidence of cooking only when it was strictly required. A coat rack by the front door with 2 hooks and only 1 coat on it. Elena stood in the front hall and looked at everything with her practical, measuring eyes. I'll show you your room, Cole said. The room was upstairs, at the back, smaller than the front bedroom, but decent size, with a window that looked out toward the pines. There was a bed frame with a mattress, a chest of drawers, a hook on the back of the door. He'd put fresh sheets on 3 days ago and had been vaguely anxious ever since that they weren't right somehow, which was an anxiety he found embarrassing in a man of his age. This is fine, she said, setting her suitcase on the bed. Thank you. Kitchen's downstairs off the back. Pump works, but you have to prime it when it's cold. Outhouse is... I'll find everything, she said. Not rudely, just efficiently. Like she'd done this before. Arrived somewhere new and figured it out without needing a tour. He nodded. Supper's usually around 6. I'll make supper, she said, tonight and going forward. That's part of the arrangement. He opened his mouth, then closed it. All right. Is there food in the house? Pantry's stocked. Got a side of beef in the smokehouse still, salt pork, flour, cornmeal, dried beans, root vegetables in the cellar. That'll do. She was already unwrapping her coat. 6 o'clock? 6 o'clock, he agreed. He went back downstairs feeling vaguely like he'd been managed, but not in an unpleasant way. More like the feeling of handing something complicated off to someone who clearly knows what to do with it. Supper that night was pork and potato stew with bread she'd found flour to bake in 3 hours, which was either impressive or alarming. Cole wasn't a man who had opinions about food usually. He ate what was available and was grateful when it was warm. But he sat down at that table and took the first spoonful, and something in his face did something he wasn't entirely in control of. It was good. Genuinely, unexpectedly good. Not fancy. Just right. Seasoned correctly, warm in a way that the kitchen hadn't been warm in a long time. Elena sat across from him and ate without fanfare. Where did you learn to cook? He asked, which was more words than he'd said voluntarily to another person in about 2 weeks. She looked up. Slight pause, not like she was deciding whether to answer, more like she was deciding how much to answer. My mother, she said. Back home. Where's home? Another small pause. Bohemia. It was a long time ago. He nodded, didn't push. The word was in that sentence told him enough. That home wasn't a place she was going back to. You've been in America long? He asked. 7 years. Speak English well. I worked at it. She said it simply, without pride and without modesty. Just a fact. She had worked at it. They ate in silence for a while. Not uncomfortable silence, just the kind that settles between two people who don't know each other yet but aren't fighting it. The townspeople, she said eventually. They were watching us drive through. Small town, he said. Not much else to watch. They don't approve. He set down his spoon. Some of them don't. They'll get used to it or they won't. Either way, it doesn't change the situation. She looked at him steadily. What is the situation exactly? For you, I mean. How do you want people to understand this? It was a direct question, and it deserved a direct answer. You work in my house. You get room and board and a wage. That's what it is. And if people suggest otherwise, then they're wrong, and they can take it up with me. Something in her expression shifted slightly. Not relief exactly, but something like it. Like a tension she'd been holding quietly had been allowed to ease a fraction. Good, she said. That's clear. I'm a plain-spoken man, he said. I noticed. She picked up her spoon again. I find that easier to work with than most alternatives. The next morning, Cole was up at 5, which was his habit. He'd stopped needing an alarm clock somewhere around age 30. He came downstairs expecting the cold quiet of a house still sleeping, expecting to put on yesterday's coffee grounds for a second time and eat whatever was left from the night before. Instead, he walked into the kitchen to find Elena already there, already dressed, already with a fire going in the stove and a pot on the heat and the smell of coffee and real coffee, fresh coffee, filling the room. She was standing at the work table, slicing bread with efficient strokes, and she looked up when he appeared in the doorway and said, Coffee's ready. Eggs in a few minutes. He stood there for a moment, genuinely caught off guard. Not by the food, by the simple, unremarkable, extraordinary fact that there was another person in the kitchen. You don't have to be up this early, he said. You're up, she said. You need breakfast before work. I usually just... Whatever you usually just do, she said. It's not enough before a day in this cold. Sit down. He sat down. Later, he would think that was the moment something shifted. Not dramatically, not the way things shift in stories where violins swell and light changes. Just quietly. The way ice shifts in a river in late winter, when you can't see it yet, but you can hear it. A low, deep sound underneath everything, something starting to move. That first week, Elena was like a very competent ghost. She was there without being intrusive. Things happened. Firewood appeared stacked near the door. A draft that had been whistling under the kitchen window for months was silenced by a strip of cloth she'd wedged in without asking permission. Meals materialized at the time she'd established without discussion. Cole would come home to find the house warmer than when he'd left it. The lamps cleaned and filled, the rug beaten and rehung. He didn't know what to do with any of this. It wasn't that he was ungrateful. He was, in fact, more grateful than he was comfortable admitting, because being comfortable with gratitude required being comfortable with need, and Cole Mercer had spent a long time making sure he didn't need anything he couldn't provide for himself. It was safer that way. It was simpler. Having someone in the house complicated simplicity. Harlan noticed the change on the third day. Harlan Briggs was Cole's deputy, a broad, cheerful man of 35 who had been married to Agnes for 12 years and had 3 daughters, and the general disposition of someone who found the world basically agreeable. He came by the office that Wednesday with a self-satisfied look Cole recognized immediately. "You look better," Harlan said, settling into the chair across from Cole's desk. "I look the same." "You had a hot breakfast." Cole looked up from the report he was not really reading. "What of it?" "Just saying." Harlan was doing his best not to grin and losing the battle. "Agnes says she saw Miss Novak at the general store this morning, said she was polite, bought what she needed, and had a list written out proper in a notebook." "Good for her." "Agnes liked her." "Agnes likes everybody." "Agnes does not," Harlan said firmly. "Agnes liked her specifically, said she looked like someone who knew what she was doing." Cole said nothing, which was a form of agreement. "People are talking," Harlan said, his tone going slightly careful. "I know. Millie Voss told the Reverend she thinks it's inappropriate." "Millie Voss thinks everything south of the Arctic Circle is inappropriate." The Reverend went and talked to her about it, not ordering anyone around, just voicing concern. Cole set down his pen. "Is there an actual problem here, Harlan, or are you working up to asking me something?" Harlan spread his hands. "Just keeping you informed." "I'm informed." He picked up the pen again. "She's a hired housekeeper. She's doing the job she was hired to do. Anyone who has a problem with that can come tell me directly." "And if they do? Then they'll have told me directly," Cole said. "And I'll have told them directly what I think of it, and that'll be the end of it." Harlan stood up, still fighting the grin. "All right, Sheriff." "Harlan." "Yeah?" "Don't make this into something it isn't." The deputy raised both hands in a gesture of pure innocence. "Wouldn't dream of it." What Cole didn't tell Harlan, what he hadn't told anyone and wouldn't have known how to say if he'd tried, was that the house was different, not just warmer, not just cleaner, different. Like the air in a room changes when a window opens. You can't point to one thing and say that it's just the whole composition of the air, the quality of it. He came home on the 4th night to find her sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil, writing something that she folded away quickly when he came in. Her posture changed slightly. Not dramatically, but the fold happened and the paper went under her hand and she looked up with an expression that said, "This is mine," without saying anything at all. He understood that. He had things that were his too, private things. He didn't ask. "There's food on the stove," she said. "I didn't know what time you'd be back." "Had a situation at the Dawson Ranch. Nothing serious." He hung up his coat. "Fence dispute." "Those happen a lot?" "Constantly. Out here it's either water rights or fence lines. Been going on since before I took this job." He poured a glass of water at the pump, worked the handle twice to get it going. "You settling in all right?" She considered the question honestly, which he appreciated. She wasn't the type to answer automatically. "The cold is harder than I expected," she said. "Not the temperature exactly, the way it comes inside, the way it finds every gap. Draft under the back door's been there since I moved in. I've tried 3 times to fix it." She nodded slowly. "I'll look at it tomorrow." "You don't—" "It bothers me," she said simply. "I'll look at it." He sat down at the table. She put food in front of him. Roasted pork, something with the root vegetables. More of that bread that was embarrassingly better than what he'd been making himself for years. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She sat down across from him. "You can ask?" "The letter you sent. You said you understand winter." He looked at her. "What did you mean by that?" She was quiet for a moment, turning her cup in her hands. "Where I grew up," she said carefully, "winter was not just weather, it was a condition, the way things were. You learned early that you couldn't fight it. You could only prepare and endure and wait for it to end. Where did you grow up exactly? A village, she said. Small, mountains. You wouldn't know it. Her voice was matter-of-fact, but the matter it was dealing with was something with more weight than the words suggested. We left when I was 22. My family, or some of us left. The some of us sat between them for a moment. I'm sorry, he said. He meant it, without elaboration, and she seemed to understand that. It was a long time ago, she said. I'm here now. Here now. He thought about that later, lying in bed listening to the wind work its way around the eaves. There was a particular kind of person he'd found over the years, in the army, in cow camps, in towns like this one, who said things like, I'm here now not as resignation, but as a kind of philosophy. Not pretending the past didn't happen, not denying it, just deciding that what was in front of them was what they were going to deal with. He had a grudging respect for that. It was, he supposed, not entirely different from how he'd been living himself. The second week, the temperature dropped further, and the social pressure in Red Hollow rose in almost perfect inverse proportion. Millie Voss was 63, had been widowed twice, and had the moral authority of someone who has outlived everyone who might have argued with her. She was not a bad woman. Cole had known her since he'd taken this job, and she'd done genuine good in the community in her time. But she had a certainty about how things ought to be that made her difficult to deal with when she'd decided something was wrong. She came to the house on a Tuesday morning. Cole was at work. He found out about it that evening when he came home to find Elena in the kitchen, working with more force than the bread dough strictly required, punching it down with the kind of controlled effort that suggested she was being very deliberate about not throwing something. Someone came by? He asked, reading the room. She looked up. Whatever expression she'd been wearing rearranged itself into something calmer. A woman, older. She gave me her name, but What did she look like? Silver hair, very straight, good boots. Millie Voss. Elena's face told him he'd identified the right woman. What did she say? She said... Elena paused, choosing her words. She expressed concern about the nature of the arrangement. She said that a woman living in a single man's household her word was unseemly. She said people were talking. She said she felt it was her responsibility to make sure I understood the impression I was making. Cole took off his coat and hung it with the same deliberateness Elena had been using on the bread dough. What did you say back? I said thank you for her concern and closed the door. He looked at her. You closed the door on Millie Voss. I said thank you first, Elena said. I was polite. Something that was not quite a smile moved across his face before he got it under control. I'll talk to her. You don't need to. I want to. Sheriff. She turns to face him fully. I've had people tell me I didn't belong somewhere before. In this country, in other places before this, I've had people look at me and decide what I was before I'd said 2 words. She held his gaze steadily. I know the difference between a serious threat and a woman who enjoys feeling important. This was the second kind. I can handle the second kind. He held her gaze for a moment. You sure? I'm sure. She turned back to the bread. Although, she added somewhat under her breath, if there's a way to make sure she knows you're not bothered by any of this, that would probably help more than anything I could say. He thought about it. I can do that. Good. He went to talk to Millie Voss the next morning, and he was, as always, direct. He said that Miss Novak was a respected employee in his household, that the arrangement was entirely proper, and that he'd appreciate it if Mrs. Voss would direct her concerns, in the future, to him rather than to his staff. He said it pleasantly. He said it in a tone that left no room for negotiation. Mrs. Voss had pursed her lips so tight her whole face went narrow, but she'd nodded, and she'd held her tongue, which, from Millie Voss, was as close to a concession as you were going to get. The child arrived on a Friday in the 3rd week. His name was Thomas Garrett. He was 8 years old, he had a front tooth missing, and the peculiar fearlessness of children who haven't yet learned what they're supposed to be afraid of. His mother, Sarah Garrett, lived 3 houses down and had recently had a second baby, which meant Thomas had a great deal of energy and no one to direct it at. He showed up at the back door while Elena was in the yard, checking the woodpile. Are you the foreign lady? He asked, with the matter-of-fact bluntness of an 8-year-old who has heard adults saying something and is simply repeating it. Elena looked at him. I am from another country, yes. Which one? Bohemia. He considered this. Is that far? Very far. Do they have snow there? More snow than this sometimes. He thought about that. What's your name? Elena. What's yours? Thomas Garrett. My mama just had a baby and she's always tired. Babies do that, Elena said. Do you have any babies? No. Do you want one? Elena blinked, then said carefully, I think that's a question for later in my life. Thomas accepted this with the quick pivot of the very young. What are you doing? Counting the firewood, making sure there's enough for the week. Can I help count? She looked at him. He had very serious eyes for an 8-year-old. Not sad, just attentive, the kind of eyes that actually look at things. Do you know how to count past 100? She asked. He drew himself up. I know how to count to 500. Good, she said. Then you can verify my math. He counted the woodpile with the total commitment of a child given a real job to do, calling out numbers in a loud, emphatic voice that frightened a jay out of the pine tree. Elena stacked as he counted. They worked in the cold for 20 minutes, and when they were done, she brought him inside for hot cider, which he drank with both hands around the cup and his feet swinging off the chair. He came back the next day. And the one after that. By the end of the second week, his mother Sarah came to the door, baby on her hip, looking apologetic. I'm so sorry he keeps showing up, she said. I've told him to leave you alone. He's not a bother, Elena said, and meant it. He keeps me company. He has good observations about the woodpile. Sarah Garrett laughed, a tired sound with real warmth in it. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her hair was pulled back with the efficiency of someone who doesn't have time for hair anymore. He talks about you constantly. Elena says, Elena does. She stopped herself. He can be a lot. He's 8, Elena said. He's supposed to be a lot. Come in. I made soup this morning. Sarah Garrett looked at the invitation with the expression of someone who has been running on no sleep for 6 weeks and has just been offered a chair. I shouldn't... Come in, Elena said again. The baby can sleep on the kitchen bench. I've patted it. The way Sarah Garrett walked through that door, with relief so deep it was almost physical, told Elena something about the town she hadn't understood before. It wasn't that these women were unfriendly, it was that they were tired and stretched, and their world didn't have a lot of slack in it. A warm kitchen and a bowl of soup wasn't charity, it was just a moment of air. Sarah came back the next week, and the week after that. And she brought 2 other women who were also tired, also stretched thin, and who sat in Elena's kitchen and drank her coffee and talked, really talked, in a way that a woman can when she's not trying to maintain a public face. Cole came home one evening to find 3 women and a baby in his kitchen and stopped in the doorway with the expression of a man who has opened the wrong door. Elena looked up from the stove. Sheriff, you remember Sarah Garrett, and this is Martha Holt and B. Collins. Ladies, he touched his hat, started backing out. Supper's in 20 minutes, Elena said. There's enough. I can eat at the... Sit down, Sheriff, Martha Holt said cheerfully. She was a large, practical woman who ran the dairy farm with her husband. You're in your own house. He sat down. He ate supper with 4 women and a baby, and the conversation went around him like water around a stone, and he found, to his own confusion, that it wasn't as terrible as he'd expected. After the women left, he stood in the kitchen while Elena cleaned up and finally said, How did that happen? Sarah came by with the baby. The others came with Sarah. Elena wiped down the table. Is it all right? The house being used this way? He thought about it. It's fine, he said. Just wasn't what I expected. What did you expect? He didn't have a good answer for that. The town was watching me, Elena said, not looking up from the table. I thought, if they came here, if they saw that the kitchen was just a kitchen. She stopped. It seemed like a more useful approach than arguing with people. He looked at her. She was still wiping the table, the same spot 3 times over, and her shoulders had something careful in them, like she wasn't sure if she'd overstepped. It was smart, he said. She looked up. Using the house like that, he said. It was smart. I wouldn't have thought of it. Something in her expression went not quite soft, but released. Like when you've been bracing for a cold wind and it doesn't come. "Thank you," she said, simply, without making it bigger than it was. He nodded and went to hang up his coat, and the kitchen settled into the kind of quiet that had, somehow, over 3 weeks, stopped feeling like empty space and started feeling like something else. Something he didn't have a word for. Something that filled the room without taking up any of the air. The cold deepened into December with the methodical cruelty of something that doesn't mean anything personal by it. It just gets colder because that's what it does. The thermometer outside the back door, which Cole had never paid much attention to before, became a number he checked without thinking, the way you check a wound. He started noticing other things he hadn't expected to notice. The way she hummed sometimes when she was working, not songs exactly, or not songs he knew, just a sound at the edge of melody that stopped the moment she realized he'd come into a room. The way she read at night, if there was a book available. She'd get through them faster than seemed possible, and she didn't treat them preciously. She read like she was hungry, pages turned quickly, efficiently, like she was extracting what she needed and moving on. The way she looked at the landscape. He caught it one morning. He'd been coming around the side of the barn and she was standing at the fence line, looking out at the snow-covered field and the mountains beyond, and her face had none of its usual purposeful composure. She was just looking. The way a person looks at something that is both too large and too beautiful to fit inside your head all at once. And so you stand there and let it work on you anyway. He didn't say anything. He went around the other side of the barn and let her have the moment. But he thought about it later in a way he hadn't expected to. He thought, she notices things. He thought, I had forgotten that some people still do that. One evening in mid-December, the temperature dropped to -12, and a pipe in the upstairs bathroom split. Not the one they used, a smaller one that fed the second-floor wash basin, but it was enough to send water running down through the ceiling of the hallway. He heard the ceiling crack at 9 in the evening, that distinctive pop of stressed wood, and went upstairs to find Elena already there, in the hallway, with a bucket, having gotten there first. I heard it, she said. I'll need to get into the wall, he said, looking at the wet streak coming down through the plaster. Tonight, before it gets worse. What do you need? Pipe fittings from the tool shed, lantern, spare rags, old ones, not the good ones. I'll get the lantern, she said. You get the pipe fittings. For the next 2 hours, they worked in the cramped space of the upstairs hallway. Cole in the wall, Elena handing him tools when he asked for them, holding the lantern at angles he directed, pressing rags into cracks when he needed a second set of hands. She didn't complain about the cold in the hallway, didn't complain about the awkward positions, didn't need instruction more than once. At one point he had to reach past her for a wrench and his hand brushed her arm, and neither of them said anything about it, but it sat in the air for a moment. The simple physical fact of another person, close, working alongside you. At 11, the pipe was fixed, cold, cramped, hands dirty, both of them tired. She made tea, not as a suggestion. She just made it and put a cup in front of him and sat across from him, and they drank it without saying much in the warm, alive quiet of a house that had just survived a minor crisis. He looked at his hands, still a little dirty, red from the cold. You're handy, he said, meaning it. She looked at her own hands, a slight smile that was almost nothing. I had to be, she said. Same, he said, and for a moment it was that simple, just two people around a table at the end of a cold night who understood each other without needing to explain. The wind hit the side of the house with a long, low sound like something enormous breathing. December had barely started. The worst, though none of them knew it yet, was still to come. But inside the kitchen, the tea was warm and the lamp was lit, and the house, for the first time in a very long time, felt less like an empty place that happened to have a person in it and more like somewhere someone actually lived. The pipe they'd fixed that December night held. Cole checked it every morning for a week, pressing his palm flat against the wall near the repair the way you check a wound you're not sure closed right. It held. That was something. December moved through Red Hollow the way a slow, indifferent river moves through a narrow canyon. Not fast, not dramatic, just steady and cold and completely unconcerned with how anyone felt about it. The days got shorter until they were barely days at all, just a few pale hours of gray light bracketed by darkness that went on and on. The temperature settled into the kind of cold that stops being shocking and becomes simply the condition of existing. You dressed for it, you moved through it, you came inside and felt your face start working again. That was the rhythm. Inside the sheriff's house, a different kind of rhythm was establishing itself, quieter and harder to name. Elena had been there 6 weeks when Cole realized he'd stopped noticing the changes she made and started just living with them. The coffee that was always ready before he came downstairs. The particular way she'd reorganized the pantry so that things he needed frequently were at the front, though he'd never told her what those things were. She'd just figured it out by watching. The front hall had a mat now that hadn't been there before, which meant he stopped tracking snow across the floorboards, which meant the floors stayed cleaner, which meant he didn't know what it meant exactly. It meant the house was being cared for by someone who paid attention. That was something Cole hadn't experienced in a long time, and he wasn't entirely sure how to receive it. He managed, mostly, by not thinking about it directly. Harlan came by the house one Thursday evening, officially to drop off a report that could easily have waited until morning, unofficially to assess the situation with his own eyes. He stood in the front hall with his hat in his hands and looked around with the transparent curiosity of a man who has been told things by his wife and wants to verify them. "Something smells good," Harlan said. "She's making venison stew," Cole said. "Give me the report." Harlan handed it over, didn't move toward the door. "Rug's new. Elena found it in the storage room. It was my mother's. I'd forgotten it was there." Harlan looked at the rug, dark red and brown, a good heavy one, then looked up at Cole with an expression that was working very hard to be neutral. "Don't," Cole said. "I didn't say anything." "You were about to." Harlan put his hat back on. "Agnes sent me with something." He reached into his coat and produced a small jar. Preserves, by the look of it. "For Miss Novak, wild blueberry from last summer. Agnes said to say she heard she liked blueberries." Cole took the jar. "How did Agnes hear that?" "Sarah Garrett mentioned it." "When did Agnes talk to Sarah Garrett?" "They talk all the time, Cole. Women talk to each other. It's a whole thing that happens." Harlan started toward the door. "Tell her Agnes says hello." Cole stood holding the small jar of blueberry preserves and listening to Harlan's boots on the porch steps, and something about the small, dense weight of it in his hand made him feel something he couldn't quite locate, like something turning over slowly. Not an emotion exactly, more like the precondition of one. He set the jar on this kitchen table without saying anything about where it came from. Elena found it when she came in from the back room, picked it up and read the handwritten label, and her face did something brief and unguarded, a kind of warmth that she wasn't quick enough to arrange into something more composed. "That's from Harlan's wife," Cole said from behind his newspaper. "Agnes." Elena set the jar down carefully. "That was kind of her." "She's a kind woman." A pause. "Is she a friend of yours?" He thought about it. "She and Harlan have had me for dinner maybe twice a year since I took this job. She makes sure I eat decently at Christmas." He folded the paper. "I wouldn't say friend, exactly. More, she looks out for me in a way I didn't ask for." "That sounds like a friend," Elena said. He looked at her over the paper. She had her back to him, checking something on the stove, and there was something almost amused in the set of her shoulders. He let it go. "There's a gathering," he said. "Saturday, at the Grange Hall. Every year before Christmas. The whole town goes. Potluck supper, fiddle music." He stopped. "You don't have to go." She turned around. "Are you going?" "I go every year. Town expects the sheriff to be present." "Then I'll go," she said, as if that settled it. "People will talk more," he said. Not warning exactly, just stating the fact. "They're already talking," she said. "Going together is more honest than me staying home like I have something to hide, which I don't." He hadn't thought about it that way. "No," he said, "you don't." "Then we'll go," she said, and turned back to the stove. He sat there for a moment with the newspaper unfolded in his hands, looking at the headline without reading it, and thinking, not for the first time, that Elena Novak had a way of making complicated things simple by just saying them plainly. He found that he'd started relying on it more than was strictly professional, The Saturday gathering was the largest social event Red Hollow managed in the winter months, which was why the Grange Hall was decorated with more effort than skill. Paper chains, a pine bough over the door, lanterns hung at intervals that made some parts of the room very bright and others nearly dark. 3 musicians set up in the corner with a fiddle, an accordion, and a man with a guitar who wasn't entirely sure of all the chords but had good rhythm. Long tables ran the length of the room, covered with food people had brought, roasts and pies and bread and pickled things, and a kettle of something that smelled like it contained more whiskey than the official recipe admitted. Cole walked in with Elena, and the room didn't stop exactly, but it adjusted. He'd been sheriff long enough to feel the way attention shifted in a space when he entered it. Usually it was professional, deferential, the quiet recalibration that happened when law enforcement arrived. This was different. This was curiosity, judgment, assessment, the specific attention of a community deciding what to make of something unfamiliar. Elena walked in beside him without slowing down. She'd dressed carefully. The same good coat, but with a dark green dress beneath it that he'd never seen before, and her hair pinned up differently. Not dramatically different, just chosen rather than merely arranged. She looked like a woman who had decided to be here, not one who'd been brought along. He introduced her to people because that was what you did, and each introduction was its own small social negotiation. Martha Holt came over immediately and took Elena's arm and pulled her toward the food tables, talking in the warm, efficient way of a woman who has decided to make someone feel welcome and is going to accomplish that goal whether they like it or not. Cole watched Elena go, saw the slight surprise in her shoulders, not used to being pulled, to someone just deciding she was included, and then saw her relax into it. He stood by the wall with a cup of something warm and watched the room for a while. Doc Tillman came and stood beside him, which was what Doc Tillman did at every social event. Stood near Cole and made observations about the gathering with the comfortable cynicism of a man who had seen enough of human nature to find it mostly entertaining. "She's doing well," Tillman said. "She's managing," Cole said. "Same thing. In a crowd like this." Tillman sipped his drink. "Millie Voss has been watching her like she's waiting for something to go wrong." "Millie's always waiting for something to go wrong." "True. But she looks conflicted tonight. I think she came prepared to disapprove and is finding the material insufficient." Tillman had a small, dry smile. "The Garrett boy told half the town she can count to 500. Apparently that's her primary qualification in his assessment." Cole watched Elena across the room, talking to Sarah Garrett and 2 other women. She said something, and Sarah laughed. A real laugh, the full one, not the polite kind. And Elena's face had a brief, genuine pleasure in it that Cole had seen in private but not in a crowd before. It looked different here, in the lamplight, surrounded by people. It looked like something she wasn't entirely used to having. He thought, she's been alone a long time, longer than me maybe, and that's saying something. He thought, she doesn't wear it obviously, but it's there. He finished his drink and went to find something to eat and stopped thinking about it, because that was the sensible thing to do. Later in the evening, the fiddle player started something up-tempo, and a few couples moved to the cleared end of the room. Thomas Garrett, apparently unsupervised, materialized at Elena's elbow and informed her seriously that she was required to dance because he had told everyone she could. Elena looked down at him with an expression that was trying to be stern and not quite managing it. "I didn't say I could dance," she told him. "But you can, right?" "That's not the point. Can you, though?" She looked up and caught Cole's eye across the room. He raised his cup very slightly. Not an offer, not a refusal, just an acknowledgement that he'd seen the problem she was in. She narrowed her eyes at him briefly, then looked down at Thomas. "One dance," she said, "and you lead." Thomas Garrett led, with the complete commitment of a child who has no self-consciousness about being terrible at something. And Elena followed with the kind of grace that comes not from training, but from simply having good instincts about where her feet were. They were objectively a disaster as a dancing pair. The room found it delightful. Even Millie Voss in the corner had something happening at the corner of her mouth that might, in another woman, have been a smile. Cole didn't dance. He never danced. But he watched. And something about the image, this woman he'd hired for practical reasons, spinning around a wooden floor with an 8-year-old who was calling out his own counts under his breath, in this rough-hewn hall in a frontier town that had only just decided to accept her. lodged somewhere behind his sternum in a way that he recognized as meaningful and chose, carefully, not to examine. The ride home was quiet in the way the rides to town were quiet, except different. The quiet going into Red Hollow was empty. The quiet coming back from it was full of something, the way silence is different after music. "That went well," she said, somewhere around the halfway mark. "Better than expected," he agreed. "Millie Voss almost smiled at me. I saw. I'm going to count that as a victory. I think you've earned it." She pulled her coat tighter against the cold and looked up at the sky, which was enormous and star-filled, and the kind of thing you forgot existed when you were inside too long. "Martha Holt invited me to help with her cheese-making next week," she said. "You know how to make cheese?" "No, but she seems like the kind of woman who enjoys teaching." "She is," Cole said. "She'll have you doing it right in 20 minutes and acting like you've known it for years." "That's exactly the kind of woman I want to spend time with," Elena said. He glanced at her sideways. She was looking at the sky still, and her profile against the cold dark was... He looked back at the road. The horse knew the way. "You're building something," he said. She turned. "What?" "In town. With the women. With Thomas. With the Grange." He kept his eyes on the road. "It's deliberate, what you're doing." A silence. "Yes," she said finally. "Is that wrong?" "No." He thought about how to say the next part. "It's just... most people who come to a place like this either give up on being part of it or try too hard and make people uncomfortable. You're doing something different." "What am I doing?" He was quiet for a moment. "Making yourself useful," he said finally, without asking for anything for it. People noticed that. She was quiet on her side of the wagon. The horse's breath made small clouds in the cold air. "It's the only way I know," she said eventually. "You can't argue people into accepting you. You can only show them what you actually are and wait to see if they can live with it." He thought about that for the rest of the ride home. January came, and with it the new year and the deepest cold Red Hollow had seen in a decade. The kind of cold that killed livestock if you weren't careful, that could take your fingers if you stayed outside too long without thinking about it. Cole was busier than usual. More calls to outlying ranches, frozen wells, disputes that turned ugly faster in close quarters when everyone had been inside together too long. He came home later, ate faster, went to bed in the heavy, exhausted way of a man running on about 4 hours less than he needed. Elena adjusted without being asked. Hot food at whatever hour he came back. She'd learned to keep things on low heat that could sit without ruining, stew and beans and the like. She didn't ask how his day was when he looked like the question would take too much to answer. She asked specific things, when she asked at all. Was anyone hurt? Or, did you get the situation at the Morrison Ranch sorted? Questions that let him give short answers and still feel heard, which was a skill he hadn't known anyone possessed until he encountered it. She was also, he noticed, having her own difficult days, though she didn't advertise them. He came home one Tuesday afternoon earlier than expected. A meeting in town had ended quickly, and found her at the kitchen table with a letter in her hand, not reading it, just holding it, looking at the wall. She heard him come in and had the letter folded and put away before he'd gotten his coat off, but not quite fast enough. He said nothing. Put the kettle on without being asked, because she always put the kettle on. Sat down across from her. "Bad news?" he asked. She looked at him, surprised, he thought, that he'd noticed. "My brother," she said. He wrote. "Is he well?" A pause long enough to contain a complicated answer. "He's surviving," she said. "That's what I tell myself. He's surviving." He poured the tea when it was ready and put a cup in front of her. She wrapped both hands around it the same way Thomas did, he noticed. Both hands, like it was something to hold on to. "You have family still in Bohemia?" he asked. "A brother. My parents are gone." She looked down at the cup. "He stayed when I left. He had reasons. Good reasons at the time." A pause. "The situation there is, it's not better. For people like us, it hasn't gotten better. People like you meaning Czech people, specifically Czech people who had certain ideas about independence." She looked up. "My father had those ideas, loudly. When it became dangerous to have them loudly, my brother had them quietly. I had them from America." Something shifted in her face. Not grief exactly, more the shape grief leaves behind after it's been lived with a long time. I send him money when I can. He sends letters when he thinks it's safe to. This one took 3 months to arrive. Cole looked at the table between them. 3 months for a letter. A brother in a country where it wasn't safe to think the wrong things. I'm sorry, he said. That's a hard thing to carry. Everything's a hard thing eventually, she said. Not bitterly, just factually, the way she said most things. Maybe, he said, but some things are harder than others. She looked at him, and something in his tone had caught her, because she looked more carefully than usual, like she was trying to see around the edges of what he'd said to why he'd said it. He didn't offer more, but she seemed to understand that the statement had come from somewhere personal, and she didn't push, which he appreciated. They sat for a while with their tea in the January cold, the wind doing its work outside, and something passed between them in the silence that neither of them had words for. Not comfort, exactly, or not just comfort, more like recognition. The particular relief of sitting across from someone who also knows that life can be difficult in ways that don't have tidy resolutions and isn't pretending otherwise. It was sometime in late January that Cole noticed he'd started thinking about the house differently during the day. He'd catch himself, in the middle of a conversation with Harlan or riding out to a property dispute, thinking about whether the kindling was low, whether Elena had mentioned needing anything from the general store. Small practical things, the kind of thoughts that exist in the background of a shared life. He'd lived alone long enough that he knew the difference between a house you came home to and a house you thought about while you were away from it. His house had stopped being the first kind. He didn't do anything with this observation. He put it somewhere out of the way you put something in a drawer because you don't know what to do with it yet, but you don't want to throw it out. Left it there. Went about his days. February brought the news that Caleb Prentice, who ranched 30 miles north, past the second ridge, had lost 200 head of cattle to a combination of cold and a fence collapse that had sent them into a ravine. It wasn't unusual at this point in winter for people to start looking worn down. But Prentice had lost more than cattle. He'd lost the cattle that were going to fund his daughter's schooling in the fall and pay for the repairs his barn had needed since October. He came into town looking like a man who'd had his future quietly removed while he wasn't watching. Cole dealt with the immediate problem, helped organize some emergency feed from 3 neighboring ranches, talked to the bank on Prentice's behalf about extending the time on a loan. It was the practical part of being sheriff, the part nobody wrote about in dime novels, the invisible architecture of keeping a community from falling apart at its weakest points. When he told Elena about it that evening, she listened the way she listened, without interrupting, without offering premature solutions, and then said, I'll make extra bread this week, and the soup I've been making doubles well. Would it help if I sent some out with you? You don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said. Is it useful? He thought about Prentice, who had a wife and 2 daughters, and had ridden in looking like a man at the end of something. Yes, he said. It would be useful. She made enough food for an army the next 3 days, and he took it out in a canvas-wrapped bundle strapped to his saddle. Ruth Prentice, who was 40, practical, had hands roughened by years of work and eyes that had seen a lot without going hard, opened the door and looked at the bundle, and for a moment her composure went somewhere private. Sheriff, she said. From Elena Novak, he said. Staying at my place this winter. She said to tell you. He thought about it. She said she'd been through a hard winter herself, and this kind of thing helps. Ruth Prentice took the bundle and held it against her chest. Tell her thank you, she said quietly. He rode back to Red Hollow with the image of that, a woman holding a bundle of bread and soup like it was something precious, sitting in his chest the whole way. When he came home and told Elena what Ruth had said, Elena nodded and said, good, and went back to what she was doing, and he stood in the kitchen for a moment watching her and thinking that there was a kind of person who did good things in the world without requiring an audience for it. And he had, without looking for one, apparently found one and hired her. He went upstairs to wash his hands and thought about that for a while, in the simple privacy of the washroom, before he could think of a reason to stop. The cold held through February and into the first weeks of March, longer than usual, longer than people were prepared for emotionally, even when they were prepared practically. By this point in winter, the town's patience had been worn thin the way ice thins from underneath. You can't see it, but suddenly it doesn't hold the way it did. Small things went wrong. Two men got into a fistfight over a card game that had nothing to do with cards. A family 3 streets over had a domestic situation that Cole was called to handle twice, the second time with enough force involved that he had to bring someone in overnight. There was a fire at the livery stable, small, caught quickly, but frightening enough to shake the block. January and February were survival. March was when you found out whether survival had cost you too much. Elena noticed. She noticed everything. "The town's getting frayed," she said one evening, not as a complaint, just as an observation. "It happens every year," Cole said. "March is the worst month. Everyone's been inside too long. The cold hasn't broken. The light's not back yet. What helps?" He thought about it. "Spring," he said. "When it comes. Before that." He looked at her. "Before that, not much. People manage." She didn't say anything more about it, which usually meant she was thinking. He'd learned that her silences had different qualities. The silence of not having anything to say versus the silence of assembling something. This was the second kind. 3 days later, she proposed the gathering. Not a formal town gathering, nothing official, nothing announced. Just she told Sarah Garrett, who told Martha Holt, who told B. Collins and Ruth Prentice, who told a few others, that on Friday evening there was an open kitchen at the sheriff's house, if anyone needed somewhere warm to be. No particular occasion, just the kitchen was warm and there would be food and people were welcome. Cole came home Friday evening to find 7 women, 4 children, and Harlan Briggs, who had been brought by Agnes and was clearly outnumbered and perfectly content about it, filling his house with a noise level he hadn't heard inside those walls in years. Someone had brought a fiddle. The fiddle wasn't being played yet, but its presence was optimistic. He stood in the doorway for a moment, coat still on, taking it in. Elena appeared from the kitchen with a towel over her shoulder and a look on her face that was asking him something without asking it. He looked at the room. At Thomas Garrett, asleep in the corner chair like a small, exhausted animal. At Agnes Briggs explaining something to Ruth Prentice with great enthusiasm. At the fire going and the lamps lit and the noise of people who had decided collectively to push back against March. He hung up his coat. "You need help with anything?" he asked. Something in Elena's face went easy. "The bread needs to come out of the oven," she said. "Can you—" "Yeah," he said. "I can do that." He went into the kitchen and pulled the bread from the oven, slightly clumsy because he didn't usually do this, and his hands were big for the pan. And Elena came in behind him and said, "Careful, the bottom is—" A second too late, and he burnt 3 fingers slightly and said something under his breath that was not appropriate for the children in the next room. She took the pan from him efficiently and set it on the rack, and then looked at his hand and said, "Run it under cold water," in the brisk, unsentimental voice of someone who has dealt with minor injuries their whole life. He ran it under the cold water from the pump, muttering. "You have no patience," she observed, not unkindly. "I have patience," he said. "I have 11 years of patience with this town. I just don't have patience for hot pans." "Those require different patience," she agreed. She was slicing the second loaf while she talked. "Different skills entirely. Is that a comment on my competence?" "It's a comment on specialization," she said, and the corner of her mouth was doing something. "You're very competent at many things. But not bread." "But not bread," she confirmed. He stood there at the pump with cold water running over his hand and Elena slicing bread 2 feet away, and the sound of his full house coming through the wall, laughter, voices, a child waking up and asking loudly for food, and something moved through him that he couldn't name and didn't try to. Just let it move through. Let it be what it was. The fiddle started up in the other room. Someone had decided the time had come. "Go," Elena said, not looking up from the bread. "They'll want the sheriff to be part of this." "I don't dance," he said. "Nobody's asking you to dance. Just go be present." She looked up. "You're good at that, actually, being present without taking up too much space." He looked at her. "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation," she said, which with me is usually the same thing. He dried his hand on the kitchen towel and went back into the other room, and the fiddle was going, and Thomas had woken up and was demanding to dance. And Harlan caught his eye across the room and gave him a look that meant nothing at all professionally and everything socially. And Cole looked away before Harlan could make it into something. But the house was warm, and it was full, and the last day of February had, for the first time in a long time, not felt like something to endure. It had felt in its rough-edged and imperfect and entirely unexpected way, like something else, something that maybe had a different name than endurance, something he was going to need a while longer before he could figure out what to call it. Outside, the temperature was still 15 below. The great cold hadn't broken. March still had its weeks of gray to spend. But in the sheriff's house on the edge of Red Hollow, the fire was going and the fiddle was playing and bread was cooling on the kitchen rack. And for one Friday evening in the worst month of the worst winter in a decade, that was enough. More than enough. It was, by some measures, everything. The fiddle evening in February turned out to be the last good night before everything went wrong. March came in with the specific malice of a season that knows it's supposed to be ending but hasn't decided to yet. The temperature, which had briefly, hopefully, climbed toward zero, dropped again without warning, and this time it brought wind. Not the steady, manageable wind of deep winter, but the erratic, furious kind that changed direction every few hours, that drove snow horizontally across the open ground and found every weakness in every structure and made itself known through all of them simultaneously. Cole had been a sheriff in Montana for 11 years. He knew weather the way you know a difficult person you've lived next to a long time, not with affection, but with enough familiarity to read the signs. And on the morning of March 7th, when he stepped out onto the front porch at 5 in the morning and felt the air against his face, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He stood there for a full minute, just reading it. Then he went back inside and said, "Elena." She was already in the kitchen. She was always already in the kitchen. "Something's coming," he said. She turned from the stove and looked at him, at his face, not at the window, because she'd learned by now that what the weather was doing showed up on him before it showed up anywhere else. "How bad?" she asked. "Don't know yet. Could pass over us. Could hit." He poured coffee, didn't sit down. "I'm going to the office. You should make sure the woodshed is accessible and the food stocks are counted. If we get serious snowfall—" "I know what to do," she said. "I know you do." He looked at her. "I'm just saying it out loud." She nodded once. "Be careful." He left. She went to count the woodshed. By noon, the sky had gone the color of an old bruise, and the barometer in Doc Tillman's office, the most reliable one in Red Hollow, imported from Chicago at considerable expense and treated by Tillman like a second patient, had dropped further than Tillman had seen it drop in 22 years of practice. He came and found Cole at the sheriff's office and stood in the doorway and said without preamble, "This is going to be significant." How significant? Tillman looked at him with the measured calm of a man who has delivered bad news professionally for decades. Significant enough that we should talk about which ranches are most exposed. Cole had a map on the wall of his office, hand-drawn, updated over the years, with the outlying properties marked in pencil. He and Tillman stood in front of it for 40 minutes and talked through it systematically. The Prentice Ranch, still recovering from the January cattle loss 30 miles north. The Alderson family. Widow Agnes Alderson, 2 teenage sons, their place 5 miles east of the Prentice spread. The Kohler homestead furthest out, nearly 40 miles, where the family had been there only 2 winters and didn't yet have the instincts for what serious weather required. "If this hits the way I think it's going to hit," Tillman said, "those 3 properties need to know today." "I'll send riders," Cole said. Harlan was already pulling on his coat. "I'll take the Prentice Road, faster horse." "I'll take the Kohlers," Cole said. "That's a long ride in this wind." "Which is why I'm going instead of sending someone else," Cole said, in the tone that ended that conversation. He was back by 3 in the afternoon, half frozen, with the report that the Kohlers had been warned and had started bringing their animals in, but their barn was undersized for the number of cattle they were trying to shelter, and the oldest boy, who was 14, which out here counted as a hand, had a look about him that Cole didn't love. The kind of look that said he was going to make a decision on his own at some point, probably the wrong one. "I'll go back out if the storm holds off until morning," he told Harlan. Harlan looked at the sky. The sky made its own opinion evident. "It won't hold off until morning," Harlan said. He was right. The storm came at 6 in the evening with a force that Red Hollow hadn't experienced since 1872, according to Amos Vetter, who was 74 and had experienced that one and was not inclined to minimize the comparison. It arrived not as snow exactly, but as a total commitment to becoming a different kind of world, a white, blinded, howling world where the ground and the sky lost their distinction and everything that had been solid became uncertain. Cole made it home by 5:30, ahead of the worst of it. He came in through the back door and stopped. The kitchen was transformed, not in any dramatic way. Elena hadn't performed a miracle, but the table had been pushed to the wall, and in its place were 3 pallets made from the spare blankets and the coats from the storage room, laid out with the particular organization of someone who had thought through how many people might need to fit. The stove was loaded and going hard. Every pot in the kitchen was either full of something or filled with water. Every lamp was lit and the oil reserves were stacked near the door. Elena was standing at the counter cutting dried meat into a large pot, and she looked over her shoulder when he came in. "I talked to Sarah Garrett," she said, "and the Holt farm. I told them if it got bad enough, they should come here." He looked at the pallets. "How many people are you expecting?" "I don't know. As many as need to." She looked at him steadily. "Is that all right?" He looked at the room. His kitchen, his house, turned into something between a refuge and a plan. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly right." He changed out of his outer layer and came back to help her. He was not a man who naturally moved in a kitchen, but Elena directed him with the brisk efficiency she used in any emergency. Short sentences, clear instructions, no wasted words. He carried water, brought wood, moved furniture when she pointed at it. They worked together for an hour before the first knock came at the door. It was Sarah Garrett, baby under one arm, Thomas clinging to her coat with both hands, her face white with cold, and something that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it. Behind her, barely visible through the driving snow, were 2 other figures, the Collins family, Bea and her husband Frank, who had apparently collected the Garretts on their way. "Come in," Elena said, before any of them said anything. They came in. More followed over the next 2 hours, in 2s and 3s, families whose houses were less solid, whose situations were less certain, who had heard somehow, through the Red Hollow communication system that operated entirely on instinct and proximity, that the sheriff's house was a place to be tonight. The Holts sent their 2 youngest children with the hired hand because Martha refused to leave the farm, but didn't want the children there if the worst happened. The elderly Vader couple came, Amos moving slowly with his bad hip, but moving. 3 young men who worked at the livery stable came because their quarters above it were not adequately sealed. By 9 o'clock, there were 16 people in Cole's house. Cole stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room and looked at this, at all these people in his space, the noise and the warmth and the particular chaos of a group of humans trying to manage fear by being useful to each other. Thomas was asleep on one of the pallets already, still wearing his boots, which Sarah had apparently given up arguing about. Amos Vetter was telling someone about the winter of '72 in a voice that suggested he was enjoying the audience. The Collins baby was being passed between women in the way babies get passed in close quarters. Nobody's baby, and everybody's baby. Elena moved through all of it like she'd been managing emergency situations her entire life, which, Cole was coming to understand, she essentially had. She knew where everything was, knew who needed what before they asked, kept the stove going and the food circulating, and made it all look, not effortless, nothing that night was effortless, but purposeful. Like she'd been waiting for a crisis large enough to require everything she knew how to do. At 10 o'clock, the wind hit a new register. A sound came through the walls of the house that was not wind exactly, or not just wind, but wind plus the particular resonance of a structure under serious pressure. Several people in the main room went quiet. Thomas woke up and grabbed Sarah's hand. Cole went to check every window and door, every seal. He found 2 places where the cold was getting through, one window with a failing seal, one section of the back wall near the woodshed door, and dealt with both with whatever he had available, which was rags and determination and the knowledge that it had to hold. When he came back into the main room, Harlan was there, having come through the storm from 3 blocks away looking like he'd crossed a battlefield. "Agnes and the girls are at the Holts," Harlan said, shaking snow off everywhere. "They've got more room. I came to see if you needed—" "I need you to help me think about the Kohlers," Cole said, low enough that the room couldn't hear. Harlan's face changed. "In this weather, Cole. The boy is 14 and there's a 4-year-old in that house, and their barn isn't right," Cole said. "If the animals get out, the boy goes after them. In this." Harlan looked at him for a long moment. "You can't ride out in a whiteout." "No," Cole agreed. Not yet. He looked at the window, at the absolute dark and white beyond it. But if it breaks even slightly, if there's a window, then we'll go, Harlan said. Both of us. Both of us, Cole confirmed. Elena was behind him. He didn't know when she'd moved there, but she was, and she'd heard enough. How far is the Kohler place? She asked. 38 miles north, Cole said. That's a very long way in this. Yes. She looked at him, and there was something in her face that was not a question and not a statement, more like a decision being made that she wasn't sure she had the right to make, and was making anyway. When you go, she said, you take someone who knows that road, not just Harlan, someone who's ridden it in bad conditions. I know that road. In conditions like this? He held her gaze, close enough to this. She held his gaze back for a moment longer than felt comfortable, then looked away. I'll make sure there's food ready when you get back, she said, and returned to the kitchen without another word. The storm held at its worst until 2 a.m. Then, not stopping, not breaking clean, but shifting slightly, losing the absolute blindness at its center, it gave Cole what he needed. Not good conditions, just survivable ones. The difference between can't see the hand in front of your face and can see maybe 20 feet. He woke Harlan, who was sleeping in the chair he'd sat down in 3 hours earlier. He got into his heaviest gear, the layers he'd learned over 11 Montana winters, the ones that felt like too much until they weren't. He was pulling on his second pair of gloves when Elena appeared from the kitchen. She had a canvas pack. She held it out. Food, hot in the inner wrapping. It won't stay hot, but it'll be warm for 2 hours. Dry socks, 2 pairs. The flask is coffee. Don't argue about the socks. He took the pack. I wasn't going to argue about the socks. You had the face of a man who was about to argue about the socks. He almost said something, didn't, slung the pack over his shoulder. Cole? Her voice was different. He turned. She was standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, which was the posture she used when she was holding herself together from the inside. Her face had the careful composure it wore when the thing underneath it wasn't composed at all. Be careful. Not the practical be careful of people managing a logistics problem. The other kind. I'll come back, he said. She nodded once, looked at the floor, then back up. I know you will. Just do it in a reasonable time frame. Harlan, behind Cole, said absolutely nothing, which was the most comment he could have made. They rode out into the storm. The next 5 hours were the worst of Cole's professional life, which was a high bar given 11 years of Montana winters, and before that, the Army. The road north was not a road anymore. It was a general direction through a landscape that had decided to be homogeneous, white and more white, and one that found the gap between his collar and his hat and stayed there. The horses moved with the careful, unhappy competence of animals that know conditions are bad, but trust the humans on their backs, which was a trust Cole felt the full weight of. Harlan rode slightly behind and to his left, and they didn't talk much because talking required energy they needed for other things, like staying upright and finding the trail markers Cole had memorized over years of this route. He found them one by one, a particular rock formation, a tree line with a distinctive gap, a dry creek crossing that wasn't dry in summer but in winter made a different sound than the ground around it. 20 miles out, the wind shifted again and the visibility dropped back toward nothing. They stopped. Cole pulled up his horse and sat in the howling dark and thought, with the cold clarity that serious cold sometimes brings, about the decision in front of him. Turn back. Reasonable, defensible, possibly necessary. Or keep going on a trail he couldn't fully see to a homestead that might be fine, might not be, with a 14-year-old who was probably making exactly the kind of decision Cole was afraid he'd make. Cole, Harlan said from behind him. I know, Cole said. We can't see the... I know, Cole said again. Give me a minute. He sat in the wind and the dark and thought about the Kohler boy. Danny, his name was Danny. Cole had met him twice, and both times the kid had had that particular combination of competence and fearlessness that in adults you admired and in adolescence you worried about. And he thought about the 4-year-old who was Danny's sister, whose name he couldn't remember, and he made the only decision he was capable of making. Keep going, he said. Harlan said something very concise and profane, which was the closest he came to objection, and then followed. They found the Kohler place at 4:30 in the morning by sound before sight. The noise of animals in distress, cattle that had been pushed to a section of fence that hadn't held, and in the middle of it, barely visible in the lantern light, Cole finally spotted 50 yards out. A figure in a too-big coat doing exactly what Cole had been afraid he'd do. Danny Kohler, 14 years old, alone in a Montana blizzard at 4 in the morning trying to herd cattle back toward the barn. Cole's horse covered the ground at a pace that was dangerous in those conditions, and completely necessary. "Danny!" He had to shout over the wind. "Danny, stop moving!" The boy turned. For a moment, his face showed the expression of someone who cannot process what they're seeing, then recognition, then something that might have been relief, except Danny Kohler was 14, and relief was not a thing 14-year-old boys admitted to. "Sheriff, the fence went. I couldn't just let them—" "I know. We've got them." Cole was already off the horse, hands moving toward the cattle, reading the situation in 3 seconds. 15 head, maybe 20, milling in the confusion of the storm, fence down on the north side, barn door open, and light coming from it. "Harlan, south side. Danny, get back to the barn. I can help." "You're going to freeze your hands," Cole said, and he said it without heat, just fact, because that was how you said things to a 14-year-old who needed to hear the truth, not feel told off. "Go inside. Get the rope from the barn. Throw it to me. That I can use." The boy went. The rope came. Working with Harlan in the kind of partnership you build after years of difficult situations, Cole spent 40 minutes in the worst conditions of the night getting the cattle back to shelter. He couldn't feel his feet by the time the barn door closed. He couldn't feel 3 fingers on his left hand. He stood inside the barn in the relative warmth, relative being doing a lot of work in that sentence, relative to outside where it was trying to kill you, and breathed, just breathed, for a moment. Danny was watching him from the corner where he'd been tying off the rope ends. "You rode out here in this," the boy said. "Yes. For us." "That's the job," Cole said. He meant it. He also meant more than it, but the job was the part he could say. Danny Kohler looked at him with the complicated expression of a young man recalibrating something he thought he understood. They stayed until dawn, not because Cole wanted to, but because the conditions outside made leaving before first light a worse risk than waiting. They slept in the barn, which was not comfortable and was absolutely warmer than the alternative. Cole woke up with his back against a hay bale and ice on his collar and Harlan snoring 3 feet away, and lay there for a few minutes looking at the barn roof and thinking, with odd clarity, about the pack Elena had given him. The socks, the coffee. He thought about her face in the kitchen doorway, the particular way her arms had crossed, the thing underneath the composure. He thought, "I told her I'd come back in a reasonable time frame." He thought, "She's going to have words about this time frame." He was right. They made it back to Red Hollow by 10 the following morning, following a road that was no longer invisible. The storm had exhausted itself sometime around dawn, dropping first the wind and then, slowly, the snow, leaving behind the enormous, indifferent silence that comes after serious weather, as if the whole world has stopped to catch its breath. The town looked wrecked in small, specific ways, fences down, shutters damaged, a section of the hotel roof that was going to need work. People were outside already, assessing, beginning the practical work of aftermath. Several of them stopped when Cole and Harlan rode down the main street, and there was something in the way they stopped. Not just the recognition of the sheriff returning, but something else. Something that Cole couldn't quite read. He found out why when he got home. Elena was on the porch when he rode up, and she'd clearly been there for some time because there was a blanket around her shoulders that she'd brought from inside, and her breath made small clouds in the cold morning air, and her face when she saw him cross the yard was... He was not a man who read faces easily, but he read that one. He couldn't have told you every component of it. He could have told you that it was not casual. She came down the steps and stood in front of him where he'd stopped the horse, and for a moment she just looked at him, taking in the state of him. The ice on his coat, the exhaustion, the 3 fingers he was holding slightly away from his hand because they'd come back, but they'd come back painful. "You're hurt," she said, seeing the hand. "Frostbite, minor. I've had worse." "That's not a comfort." She reached out and took his hand by the wrist. Not the hurting fingers, the wrist, and looked at it, then looked up at his face. Come inside. I need to. The horse can wait 2 minutes. Come inside. He came inside. Harlan, behind him, quietly took both horses to the barn without being asked, because Harlan was a man who knew when to disappear. Inside, the house was warm, still full of small evidences of the night, blankets folded near the walls, dishes stacked from a large number of people having been fed. A drawing Thomas had apparently made and left on the kitchen table that was either a horse or a large dog. It was hard to say. Elena sat him down and dealt with his hand with the same competence she applied to everything, and he watched her work and didn't say anything for a moment, and then said, "The Kohler boy was in the field alone at 4 a.m. I know." She didn't look up from his hand. Ruth Prentice's husband came by at midnight to say he'd heard they might be in trouble. I was going to... She stopped. You were going to what? She pressed her lips together. I was going to ask someone to go out after you, if you hadn't come back by morning. He looked at her bent head, the dark hair, the careful way she was holding his damaged fingers. Who were you going to ask? Doc Tillman. He'd have gone, I think. Tillman's 60 years old. I know. She looked up. I had a list in order of willingness and capability. You were not supposed to be gone this long. He looked at her face, this close, in the morning light, after a night like the one they'd both just had, her in this house with 16 people, and her own particular fear running underneath all of it, him in a field in a blizzard with cattle and a reckless boy, and he thought things he'd been careful not to think, and for a moment was too tired to stop them. I said I'd come back, he said. You did. She held his gaze. You did come back. I told you I would. She was quiet for a moment, still holding his wrist, and something passed across her face that he didn't look away from, because turning away from it would have been a choice he wasn't willing to make right then, in that kitchen on that morning. Next time, she said finally, I want to know the plan before you leave, not after. That's fair, he said, and you take the extra gloves, the ones in the left side of the storage chest. I didn't know there were extra gloves in the... I know you didn't, now you do. She let go of his wrist. Eat something. He ate something. She sat across from him, which she always did, and wrapped her hands around her cup, which she always did. And outside Red Hollow was beginning the long, exhausted, communal work of assessing the damage and starting repairs. And inside the kitchen was quiet and warm and smelled like coffee and like the bread that was already, impossibly, proofing on the back of the stove. He looked at her across the table. She looked at him. Neither of them said what they were thinking, because neither of them was ready to, and because some things in their own time are smarter than saying them too soon. But it sat between them, clear and steady and undeniable. The thing that had been building since November, that the blizzard had stripped to its bones in the particular way that crisis strips everything to its bones, and shows you what's actually there. He was alive. She'd waited for him. The house was full of evidence of what she'd done while he was gone. That was what it was. Whatever it was, that was it. He finished eating and went upstairs to sleep for 3 hours because he needed to, and because sometimes the wisest thing a person can do after a night like that is sleep rather than speak. When he came back downstairs, the kitchen was clean, the food from the morning was put away, and there was a note on the table in Elena's handwriting, not elaborate, just town meeting at Grange, 3 p.m. People want to know what happened. You should be there. He went. Elena went with him, slightly behind and to his right, the way she'd learned to walk in public in Red Hollow, present, not hidden, but reading the room. What happened at that meeting was something none of them had quite planned for. Caleb Prentice stood up and said what he'd seen, the sheriff riding out in a whiteout to reach the Kohler homestead, the food that had come out to his ranch in January, the woman who had kept the town's children safe and fed through a night that could have gone wrong in a dozen ways. He wasn't an eloquent man, Prentice. He said things plainly, the way farmers say things, without decoration. But plain is sometimes exactly right. When he sat down, there was a silence, and then Martha Holt said something, and then 3 more people said things. And somewhere in the middle of it, Cole looked sideways at Elena and found her looking at the table, her jaw set, her hands flat on the surface, and the particular stillness of a person who is trying very hard not to show what they're feeling. He said nothing. He put his hand next to hers on the table, not touching, just next to, close enough that she could feel the warmth of it if she wanted to. She didn't move away. Outside, the snow of the blizzard lay over Red Hollow in a silence that was different from the silence of the storm. Calmer. The kind that comes after. Inside the Grange Hall, something was being said about two people that neither of them had expected to become, that neither of them had expected to be to each other or to this town when the winter started. But winter had a way of showing you what was actually there, and now the whole room could see it too. The Grange meeting ended without any formal resolution, which was how most important things in Red Hollow ended. Not with a vote or a decree, but with a general shift in the air, a collective exhaling, people going home and talking to their spouses, and waking up the next morning having quietly decided something without needing to announce it. What had been decided, as best Cole could interpret it, was that Elena Novak had earned her place here. Not given it, earned it. There was a difference, and in a frontier town, the difference mattered more than most things. He didn't tell her that directly. He wasn't sure how. Instead, he noticed the way people treated her in the days after the blizzard, the specific warmth of the formerly reserved, which is a different thing from ordinary warmth. Ruth Prentice stopped by the house with a jar of honey and stayed for an hour. The woman who ran the general store, who had previously spoken to Elena with the careful politeness of someone uncertain about a new situation, called her by her first name for the first time and asked her opinion on the new flower stock. Small things. The kind of things that don't mean anything individually and mean everything in aggregate. Elena noticed too. She absorbed it with the same quiet attention she brought to everything, without making a production of it, without the expansive relief of someone who'd been desperate for approval. More like recognition. Like something she'd been working toward had arrived, and she acknowledged it and went back to work. The frostbitten fingers healed. Cole's back, which had seized up from the night in the Kohler barn, took about a week longer. He didn't mention the back to anyone because he was 41 and stubborn, but Elena noticed the way he moved and, without comment, started leaving the chair nearest the stove angled toward the kitchen instead of the table, which was a small adjustment that made a difference he was not going to acknowledge out loud. "You don't have to do that," he said one morning when he caught her doing it. "Do what?" she said from the other side of the kitchen, entirely innocent. He looked at the chair, looked at her. "Thank you," he said. She handed him his coffee. "Sit down before you hurt it worse." March finally, grudgingly, began its retreat. The cold didn't leave all at once. It never did in Montana. It backed away in stages like something reluctant, giving ground and then reclaiming it, and then giving it again. But there was a change in the light first, the way there always was, before the temperature followed. The days got longer in increments you could actually measure. The sun, when it appeared, had an angle that was different from the winter angle, lower and sharper, and actually warm when you turned your face to it. Cole caught Elena doing this one afternoon in the yard, standing with her face up and her eyes closed, turned toward the sun like a plant that had been indoor too long. She heard him coming and opened her eyes and didn't look embarrassed about it, which he appreciated. "It's warmer," she said. "Not yet," he said. "But it will be." She looked at the sky. "I was thinking about writing to my brother, telling him, I don't know, that things are better here." "Are they?" he asked. "Better?" She looked at him, and the question landed between them with more weight than 4 words usually carried, because they both understood it wasn't just about the weather or the town's attitude or the practical logistics of a hired position. "Yes," she said. "They are." He nodded. He didn't push past that, but he carried the answer with him through the rest of the afternoon like something he'd picked up and wasn't ready to put down. It was in this tentative early spring light that the town council meeting happened, which Cole had known was coming and had been vaguely dreading in the way you dread a thing you want and aren't sure how to manage wanting. The Red Hollow Town Council met on the second Tuesday of each month in the back room of the Grange Hall, around a table that wobbled on one side and had done so for 3 years despite multiple attempted repairs. There were 5 council members: Harold Birch, who ran the general store, Doc Tillman in his capacity as town health officer, Councilwoman Agnes Vetter, who was Amos's daughter-in-law, the hotel proprietor James Sutton, and the council chairman Walt Greer, who had been a judge in a previous life in Illinois and ran meetings with a formality that occasionally felt excessive for a room with a wobbling table. Cole attended as a matter of course. He had no vote, but his presence was expected, and his opinion on matters of town security and community welfare was solicited and generally followed. This meeting had one item of business that wasn't on the written agenda. Walt Greer cleared his throat in the particular way he cleared his throat when he was about to say something he'd been thinking about for a while. "I'd like to address the matter of Miss Elena Novak," he said. Cole looked at him, said nothing. "I think I speak for the council," Greer continued, "when I say that what she did during the storm, opening the house, organizing the shelter, managing 16 people through the worst night we've seen in 30 years, went considerably beyond what any of us had a right to expect." He paused. "There's also the matter of the work she's done with the women in town, the Prentice family, the ongoing effect on several households that I've heard about from multiple sources." Another pause. "She is, by all accounts, an extraordinary person. She is," Cole said, "flat, factual." "The council would like to formally recognize her contribution," Greer said. "There's also, and I want to raise this carefully, the question of her status." Cole waited. "She arrived on a work arrangement," Greer said. "Seasonal. That arrangement doesn't confer any formal standing in the community. If she were to leave at the end of winter, which, given the terms, she would be within her rights to do, we'd lose someone who has become, in a few months, genuinely important to this town's functioning." He set his hands flat on the table. "The council would like to offer her a formal letter of citizenship endorsement, which the territorial office will recognize, along with a standing position as, I'm open to language here, community liaison or welfare coordinator, something that makes her position here permanent and recognized." The room was quiet for a moment. Harold Birch said, "She fixed my wife's cousin's fence when the cousin was sick. Nobody asked her to." Doc Tillman said, "She brought food to 4 households during the storm that weren't in the sheriff's house. I only found this out afterward." Agnes Vetter said, "My children ask about her by name." Cole sat with all of this. He had a feeling he recognized from 11 years of law enforcement, the feeling of a situation that is already decided, where your role is not to make the decision, but to confirm it. "I think," he said, "you should tell her directly, not through me. She'd want to hear it herself." Greer nodded. "We'd like to do a small gathering, public, not a ceremony. Nothing she'd find uncomfortable, just the council, some of the families who were directly helped, an acknowledgement." "I'll mention it to her," Cole said, "but I'd suggest asking rather than informing. She doesn't respond well to being arranged." Agnes Vetter smiled at that, like she recognized the description. "Noted," she said. He walked home from the meeting in the thin March sunlight with his hands in his pockets and something pressing against the inside of his chest that he'd been carrying for weeks and that the meeting had made suddenly urgent. He'd been careful. He'd been deliberately, systematically careful. About the line between employer and employee, about not making assumptions, about the fact that she was here in a situation with limited options and that complicated any reading of what existed between them. He told himself these were the right reasons for caution. They were. They were also, if he was honest with himself, which he was trying to be on this particular afternoon, convenient reasons. Reasons that let him not do the harder thing. She was in the yard when he got home, doing something with the fence line near the barn where a post had shifted in the frost. She had a mallet and was correcting the lean with the practical efficiency he'd come to recognize as her default setting in the physical world. She heard him come through the gate and didn't look up yet. "How was the meeting?" she asked. "Interesting," he said. He stood near the fence and watched her work for a moment. "The council wants to offer you a permanent position. Formal citizenship endorsement. Some kind of official community role." She stopped, looked up. "What kind of role?" They weren't specific, something that recognizes what you do here. She was quiet, testing the post with her hand. It held. She set the mallet down. "That's unexpected." "It shouldn't be." She looked at him sideways. 3 months ago, half this town thought I was a problem. 3 months ago, they didn't know you." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the fence post. "What do you think I should do?" It was a direct question and she asked it directly, which was her way, but it landed differently than practical questions usually did. It landed like she actually wanted to know. Not what the correct decision was, what he thought, his specific opinion. I think, he said carefully, that you've built something real here. That the women who come to your kitchen, and the kids who follow you around, and the Prentice family and the Kohlers, I think that's real, and it doesn't happen often, and walking away from it would be a loss, not just for the town. He stopped. For you. She looked at him for a long moment. The March wind moved some hair across her face, and she pushed it back impatiently. I didn't come here planning to stay, she said. I know. I came because I needed work, and the letter seemed honest. I know. And now, she stopped, looked at the mountains in the distance, the snow still on the upper ridges, the lower slopes starting to show the dark patches that meant the melt had begun. And now it's different. It got different somewhere in there, and I didn't notice the exact moment. No, he said. You don't usually. She looked back at him. Is that from experience? He met her eyes. Some things, yes. There it was again. That particular silence that had a different quality than other silences. That was full rather than empty. He'd been letting these moments pass for weeks, letting them build up and pass and build up again, which was not a sustainable strategy, and he knew it. Elena, he said. Cole. She said his name back at him, not mocking. More like she was making sure she had his attention. She did. The gathering the council wants to do, he said. Will you go? She looked at him for a moment longer than the question required. She'd heard what he'd almost said, he thought. She was sharp enough to hear the shape of something even when it didn't come out fully formed. Yes, she said. I'll go. He nodded, picked up the mallet from where she'd set it and put it back in the tool shed, because it was something to do with his hands. When he came back, she was heading toward the house. Supper in an hour, she said over her shoulder. All right, he said. He stood in the yard for a moment after she'd gone inside, in the weakening afternoon light, with the mountains at his back and the house in front of him, and the particular feeling of a man who has identified exactly what he wants and is working up to the courage of it. The gathering the council arranged happened on a Saturday, 2 weeks into March, which was early enough that the snow was still deep, but the worst of winter felt definitively behind them. It was held in the Grange Hall again. Same wobbly table pushed to the wall, lanterns lit, a modest spread of food contributed by various families. Not a ceremony, more like what it actually was, a community acknowledging one of its own. Elena wore the green dress again. Cole noticed this the way he noticed most things about her, c'est-à-dire sideways without making it obvious, filing it away. She'd pressed it carefully, and her hair was up the way she did it when she was trying to put a particular face to the world. Composed, present, not asking for anything. She was nervous. Could tell because she was even more efficient than usual, talked less, moved more, kept her hands occupied with cups and dishes that didn't strictly need to be moved. She didn't like being the center of attention when the attention was for her specifically. She was comfortable organizing things for other people. She was less comfortable being organized for. Walt Greer said a few words, which were decent words. He had the judge's ability to say something with weight without making it too long. He read from the council letter, which was formal but warm. He talked about the blizzard, about the shelter Elena had organized, about what several families had said to him privately. Caleb Prentice was there. He stood up without being asked and said the same things he'd said at the first meeting, but he'd had 2 weeks to think about how to say them better, and this version was more precise. He talked about January, about the food that had arrived at his door, about what his wife Ruth had said when she'd received it. He talked about his daughters, the youngest of whom was there, sitting next to Sarah Garrett's Thomas in the front row, looking at Elena with the uncomplicated admiration of children who haven't learned yet to keep their regard private. Ruth Prentice, beside him, had the same expression she'd had in the doorway in January, the one where composure was doing hard work. And this time she didn't try to hide it. When it was over, when the council letter had been read and the formal part concluded, the room shifted into the looser, warmer mode of people who have done their official business and now just want to eat and talk. Elena moved through it with more ease than Cole had expected, or maybe he'd underestimated her by this point. She talked to Ruth Prentice for a long time, the two of them in the corner with their heads close together in the way of women who are saying things they mean. She let Thomas drag her over to show her something he'd drawn, another ambiguous animal, this one apparently meant to be a buffalo. and she studied it with the seriousness it deserved. Millie Voss came and stood beside Cole. This was not something that had happened before, Millie seeking him out socially, and he braced for it. "She's remarkable," Millie said. Cole looked at her sideways. "Yes." "I was wrong about her," Millie said. Simply. No preamble, no softening. "I was wrong, and I'd like it noted that I'm saying so directly because I find that more dignified than pretending I wasn't." He turned to look at her fully. Millie Voss, 63 years old, twice widowed, the arbiter of Red Hollow's social conscience for 2 decades, was looking across the room at Elena with an expression that was, if not quite affectionate, was something in that direction, something that had traveled a long way from the disapproval of 3 months ago. "I'll note it," he said. "Good." She straightened. "She made me tea," Millie added, somewhat abruptly. "When?" "Last week. I came by to... I had an errand. She was in the yard. She invited me in and made tea, and we talked for an hour, and she did not once make me feel like a person who had to apologize for previous opinions." Millie's jaw set slightly. "That's a harder thing to do than most people understand." "It is," Cole agreed. Millie looked at him. "Are you going to let her leave at the end of winter?" The question was direct in the way Millie Voss was direct about everything, which was to say, with the force of someone who had earned the right to ask it. Cole held her gaze for a moment. "I'm working on that," he said. Millie's expression shifted into something that was very close to approval. "Work faster," she said, and moved away through the room with her straight-backed, purposeful walk. He stood against the wall and watched Elena across the room, having the same thought he'd had in the yard, the shape of what he wanted, the courage required, and added Millie Voss's endorsement to the weight of it, which made it heavier rather than lighter, but in the way of something that could no longer be left unaddressed. That evening, walking home from the gathering, they were quiet for a while in the way they were sometimes quiet, not empty, but full. The snow on the main street was packed and dirty from a week of traffic, the way snow gets in towns, losing its purity quickly under human activity. The air had the cold freshness of evening, but not the killing cold of January. Something was different in it, something lighter. "What did Millie Voss say to you?" Elena asked, halfway home. She said she was wrong about you." Elena missed a step, caught it. "She said that directly?" "More or less." A silence. Then, "That must have cost her something." "I think it did," Cole said. "I think she decided it was worth paying." Elena looked at the road ahead of them. "I went to see her last week," she said. "I brought tea things. I wasn't sure it was a good idea." "Why did you do it?" "Because she's going to be here after I'm..." She stopped. "Because she's part of this town, and I thought if she understood me a little better, it would be better for everyone. After I'm gone." That was what she'd been going to say. He heard it even though she hadn't said it. He'd been hearing the unspoken version of it for weeks. The way she didn't quite make permanent plans. The way she occasionally looked at the house with the expression of someone taking note of something they won't always have access to. She'd built something here, but she hadn't let herself fully believe it was hers. Some part of her was still holding a bag packed, waiting for the thing that would require her to move on. He understood that. He'd done versions of it himself for years. Staying in Red Hollow without ever fully committing to the idea that this was where he was going to be forever. It was a protective habit. You couldn't lose something you hadn't fully claimed. He looked at the road, looked at his hands, made a decision that was not impulsive. He was not an impulsive man, but was final, in the way decisions are final when you've been working up to them for months and have run out of reasons to wait. "Elena," he said. Stop walking for a minute." She stopped, turned to look at him. The evening light was low and the street was empty, and she had her coat collar turned up against the cold, in the way she'd had it the first night she'd stepped off the train, except that everything about her was different now. Or rather, he understood who she actually was now, in a way he hadn't in November, in the way that takes time and proximity and shared difficult weather. "I need to say something," he said, "and I need you to let me finish before you respond, because I'll lose my way if you respond in the middle." She looked at him with the direct, patient attention that was one of the things he'd valued, he'd call it, for now. "All right," she said. He exhaled. "When I put that advertisement in the paper, I was looking for practical help. That was the whole of it. I needed someone who could manage the house through winter, and I didn't think past that. It seemed like a simple problem with a practical solution. He stopped. You solved the practical problem, and then you kept going, which I wasn't prepared for. You fixed things I'd stopped seeing as broken. You brought people into the house and made them feel like the house was for them. You figured out Millie Voss by going to see her with tea. He shook his head slightly. I don't do things like that. I don't think to do things like that. She was listening without expression, holding to her promise not to respond. Her eyes were steady on his face. I don't know when it changed, he said. I know that's not a very precise statement for a man who notices things. But I can tell you what I know, which is that the house feels wrong when you're not in it. That I think about it during the day. Whether you need something from town, whether the wood's low. That is... He stopped, tried again. That is not what I do. That is not what I've done in a long time. And I'm not going to stand here and pretend I don't know what it means. The street was very quiet. Far down the block, a dog barked once and went silent. The arrangement ends when winter ends, he said. The council has offered you something permanent, which is good and right and you should take it, but I'm not asking you to stay for that. He met her eyes. I'm asking you to stay because I don't want you to go. I'm asking you to consider whether what's happened here, in this winter, in this house, is something worth building on properly, as equals. He stopped. That was the whole of it. He'd gotten there, which was something, though his heart was doing something undignified against his ribs. Elena looked at him for a long moment. The promised silence extended past the end of his statement, past what was strictly necessary, which he bore as patiently as he could. You said you'd lose your way if I responded in the middle, she said finally. What about the end? Can I respond now? Yes, he said. She looked at him with the measuring look he'd first seen on the train platform in November, taking stock, not seeking approval, trying to understand what something actually was before she gave it a name. You're a difficult man to know, she said. I'm aware. You don't say things easily. No. Which means when you say them, they mean what they say. Yes, he said. That's right. She nodded slowly like she was confirming something she'd already worked out. I've been telling myself, she said, that I was going to leave in the spring, practical, clean, no complications. She looked at her hands. I'm very good at leaving. I've done it enough times. She looked back up at him. I'm not as sure I know how to stay somewhere, what that looks like. Neither am I, he said honestly. Not like this. Something in her expression shifted, opened slightly around the edges. That's actually more reassuring than a confident answer would have been, she said. I'm not a confident man about most things. You are about some things. Different things, he said. Not this. She looked at him for another long moment. The cold had put color in her face, and the evening light was going fast, and the street was still empty, and none of that registered to him as much as the fact that she hadn't said no. I'm not going to pretend it's simple, she said. What I am, where I came from, whether this town will... The town has made its opinion fairly clear, he said. This week specifically. Towns change their opinions. Some of them do, he agreed. This one tends to change it in one direction and hold. Once it decides something about a person, it decided about me at the Grange meeting, she said. Before that, he said. Sarah Garrett decided about you the first time you fed her soup. The rest of the town just took longer to figure out what she already knew. Elena looked at him, and the careful composure did something. Not collapsed, but softened, at the corners, in the way things soften when the effort of maintaining them is no longer necessary. I wrote to my brother last week, she said. I told him things were better. I told him I'd found somewhere I might... She stopped. I couldn't finish the sentence when I wrote it. Can you finish it now? She held his gaze. I might stay, she said. I told him I might stay somewhere. The street was very quiet. The last of the light was going over the western ridge. That would require, he said carefully, someone to stay with, not just somewhere. Yes, she said, it would. He looked at her. She looked at him. The distance between them on the empty street was not very large, and neither of them moved to close it, but neither of them moved away from it either, and that was its own kind of answer. the kind that takes its time and means more for it. Come home, he said. We can talk more in the kitchen. We're good at talking in the kitchen, she said. We're better at it than talking in the street, he said. Something crossed her face that was warm and complicated and real. Not the composed expression, not the careful one, but the one underneath, the one he'd been seeing glimpses of for months. And that was, he had decided, the most honest thing about her. They walked the rest of the way home in the kind of silence that has a shape to it. That means something specific, that two people who have been careful with each other for a long time recognize as a threshold crossed. Not everything said, not everything decided, but something acknowledged that couldn't be unacknowledged, something named that had previously only been felt. The house was warm when they got back. It was always warm now. That had stopped being remarkable and started being expected, which was its own kind of change. The change from noticing something to simply having it, from careful awareness to the particular ease of trust. She made tea. He sat down. They talked for 2 hours in the kitchen, and the conversation was different from other conversations, more direct, more personal, full of things said that had been held back, as careful people hold things back until the right moment presented itself. He told her about his marriage, years ago, brief and ended badly, which he'd never told anyone in Red Hollow. She told him more about Bohemia, about her father, about the specific weight of leaving a place you love because staying would cost you something you can't afford. They talked about the winter and what it had done to both of them, and what it had done between them, which was a harder thing to talk about, but they managed it the way they managed most things, honestly, without decoration, saying what they meant and trusting that the other person would take it in the spirit offered. By midnight, the tea was cold, and they were still at the table. I should sleep, she said finally. Yes, he said. Me too. Neither of them moved for another moment. Cole, she said. Yeah. Whatever this is. She gestured slightly, at the table, at the kitchen, at the general space between them. I don't want to rush it. I want to do it right. So do I, he said. Good. She stood up, collected the cups. Then we'll do it right. She looked at him over her shoulder at the kitchen door. Good night. Good night, Elena. She went upstairs. He sat at the kitchen table for a few more minutes in the quiet, in the warm, in the house that had stopped being his house in the singular possessive some time ago without him precisely noticing the moment it had happened. Outside, the last snow of the season lay over Red Hollow, in the particular still quiet of a winter almost finished. The temperature was above zero for the first time in months. Somewhere on the south-facing slope below the eastern ridge, if you knew where to look, the frost was beginning to release its grip on the soil, and the things that had been waiting in the ground all winter for exactly this were making their slow, invisible decision to start again. That was the thing about hard winters. They didn't last. And what you found on the other side of them, what had survived the cold, what had held together when everything pressed against it, that was what was actually real. That was what was worth keeping. He turned off the lamp and went upstairs, and the house was quiet around him. And for the first time in a very long time, the quiet felt full instead of empty. Spring in Montana doesn't arrive so much as it negotiates. It offers a warm day and takes back 2 cold ones. It melts the top layer of snow and then freezes it overnight into a crust that catches the morning light like broken glass. It's not generous, not dramatic. It's incremental, provisional, a season that makes you earn it a little at a time. Until one morning you step outside and the mud is soft under your boots and the air smells like something alive again. And you realize the negotiation is over and you didn't notice the exact moment it concluded. That was how it happened in Red Hollow in the spring of 1890. Not all at once. Gradually and then completely. The snow pulled back from the lower fields first. Then the river, which had been locked and silent since December, began making noise again. A low, persistent sound of moving water that the town had stopped hearing over winter and now heard again like something remembered. Birds returned to the tree line east of town in numbers that Thomas Garrett cataloged with intense personal interest and reported to Elena in daily updates delivered at the back door before school. 7 Red Wings this morning, he announced, on a Tuesday in late March. And something brown I didn't recognize. Do you know birds? Some, Elena said. What shape was the beak? He described it with his hands more than his words. She diagnosed it as probably a thrush. He wrote this down in a small notebook he'd started carrying for the purpose, which Elena had given him in February when it became clear he needed somewhere to put his observations. "You're good at noticing things," she told him once, when he'd arrived with a description of a fox track in the snow that was precise enough to be genuinely useful. He'd accepted this with the seriousness of someone receiving a professional assessment. "My teacher says I don't pay attention," he said. "Maybe," Elena said. "You pay attention to different things than your teacher is looking at." He'd thought about that for 3 days before he came back with a follow-up question, which was, "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" And Elena had said, "Honestly, both, depending on the day," which seemed to satisfy him more than a simpler answer would have. Cole watched these exchanges from a careful distance and thought about what it meant. That this woman who had arrived in November with a rope-tied suitcase and a history she kept close had become, by March, the person an 8-year-old boy brought his best observations to. It meant something. He wasn't sure you could put it more precisely than that. The council letter came through from the territorial office in the first week of April. Formal recognition, the language dry and official, the way legal language always was, but the meaning clear. Elena Novak was a recognized resident of Red Hollow with full community standing. She read it twice at the kitchen table, folded it, put it in the small wooden box where she kept her brother's letters and a few other things she considered important. "That's it then," she said. "That's it," Cole agreed. She looked at the box. "I should write to my brother. Tell him." "You should." She looked up at him. "He'll want to know everything. He asks very specific questions in his letters. He'll want to know the town, the people, the—" She stopped. "He'll want to know about you." Cole absorbed this. "What will you tell him?" She held his gaze. "The truth," she said, "which is that I met a man who said what he meant and meant what he said, and that I found that harder to leave than I expected." He looked at the table between them. "You could tell him more than that," he said carefully. She turned the wooden box in her hands. Outside, through the kitchen window, the yard was showing the first brown patches of exposed ground where the snow had retreated, and the fence line Cole had been meaning to repair since January was very visible now that the snowdrift covering its worst section had melted. "I know I could," she said. She set the box down. "Cole, what is it you're asking me exactly? Because I want to make sure I'm answering the right question." He looked at her, at this woman who had fixed his broken house and fed half the town and stood on a train platform in November and looked at a place that didn't want her and decided to be useful anyway, who had never asked him for reassurance and had given him more than he'd known how to receive. He'd had 2 weeks since their conversation in the street to think about what he wanted to say and how to say it, and what he'd concluded was that he'd been overthinking the how when the what was actually simple. "I'm asking you to stay," he said. "Not as a hired hand, not as a community liaison. I'm asking you to stay here, in this house, as my wife, if that's something you'd want." He held her gaze steadily. "I understand if it's not. I understand if it's too fast or too complicated or not what you came here for. But I said I'd say what I mean, and that's what I mean." The kitchen was very quiet. The sound of water dripping off the eaves, snowmelt from the roof, came through the window in a slow, irregular rhythm. Elena looked at him for a long moment. He'd learned over winter to read her silences. This one was not the silence of refusal or the silence of discomfort. It was the silence of a woman who takes things seriously and was taking this seriously, which was all he could ask. "You're not a simple man to say yes to," she said finally. "I know. You're difficult and you go quiet for days and you rode into a whiteout without telling me the plan." "That last one is fair," he said. "I've been working on it." Something moved at the corner of her mouth. "You have," she said. "Marginally." "Marginally," he agreed. She looked at the wooden box, looked back at him. "I came here with nothing," she said. Not nothing materially, I mean, but nothing settled, nothing I could point to and say, this is mine, this is where I belong. I've been moving since I was 22, and every time I moved, I told myself the next place would be the one I stopped." She paused. "I got very good at leaving because I never got good at staying." "I know," he said. "I've watched you keep one foot out the door for 4 months." She looked surprised. "That obvious?" "To me," he said. "Maybe not to everyone." She absorbed that. And you still asked? Because the other foot, he said, was planted pretty solidly in the kitchen. She laughed. Short, genuine, the real one that she didn't manufacture for company. It changed her whole face when it happened, and he'd been collecting those moments without meaning to since December. Yes, she said. All right. He waited. Yes, all right. You'll think about it, or yes, she said again more clearly. Yes, I'll stay. Yes to what you asked. She held his gaze, and there was something steady in hers that he recognized as the same quality she'd had on the train platform, not performing certainty, actually having it. But I want to do this correctly. I want to write to my brother first. I want him to know. Of course. And I want... She paused. I don't want a big event. I've had enough of being the center of things this winter. Small, he said. Just the people who matter. Is that all right with you? I have 11 years of being looked at by this town, he said. Small sounds exactly right. She nodded once. The matter was settled the way most things were settled between them, directly, without theater, with the kind of quiet finality that felt more binding than ceremony. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers briefly, and she turned her hand over and held it for a moment, and then let go and stood up and said, I need to start dinner, which was Elena's version of being moved. You could tell by how quickly she found something practical to do. He sat at the table and listened to her moving around the kitchen and looked out the window at the yard where spring was making its incremental, unglamorous return, and felt something he recognized as happiness, though he'd been out of practice with it long enough that it took him a moment to name. The letter to her brother took Elena 4 days to write. Cole knew this because he could tell the night she'd been working on it. She came down to breakfast with a particular quiet about her, the quiet of someone who'd been doing something emotionally demanding in private. He didn't ask about the content. That was hers. When it was done, she let him read it. Not the personal sections, she folded those back, but the part about Red Hollow, about the winter, about him. Her brother's name was Tomasz, and she wrote to him in English because she'd been writing to him in English for years, she explained, so he could practice. What she'd written about Cole was not flowery. It was accurate. She'd described him as a man of few words and genuine ones, which he thought was the most precise thing anyone had ever said about him. She'd written that she had found, unexpectedly, a place where her particular qualities, her stubbornness, her practicality, her inability to leave problems unsolved, were not inconveniences but assets. She'd written, I think I was made for a harder life than a comfortable one, and here the hardness has a point to it. He handed it back without comment. Is it strange? She asked. Reading what someone says about you. A little, he said. It's accurate. I don't know how to write about people except accurately, she said. I tried once to write something softer and it sounded like a lie. It didn't need to be softer, he said. She put the letter in the envelope and they mailed it from the Red Hollow post office on a Thursday. And then there was nothing to do but wait for the answer and get on with things, which was what they did. Getting on with things, that spring, meant the fence line Cole had neglected, which Elena helped with on a Saturday in early April, handing posts while he drove them, neither of them talking much because the work didn't require it. It meant the garden plot behind the house, which had been fallow for 2 years while Cole was living there, and which Elena had been eyeing since February with the expression she wore when she was planning something. She turned the first soil in April, cold still, stubborn, but workable. And Cole helped without being asked, because by this point helping without being asked had become the natural grammar of how they operated. What are you planting? He asked, turning a heavy clod. Vegetables, mostly. Some herbs. She was consulting a small piece of paper she'd been writing on for weeks. I want to try potatoes. Martha Holt says the soil here is good for them. You talked to Martha about the garden? I talked to Martha about everything practical, she said. She's the most useful person in this town. Don't let Doc Tillman hear you say that. Doc Tillman's useful in specific emergencies. Martha is useful every day. She pressed her boot into the turned soil. Will you build me a cold frame for starting the seedlings? Wood and old window glass. There are panes in the storage room. I saw them, he said. Been there since I moved in. They've been waiting for someone to use them, she said. He built the cold frame that weekend. It was not his best carpentry. The corners were not perfectly square, and he had to redo one joint. But it held, and she put it against the south-facing wall where it would get the most light. And within 2 weeks, there were small green beginnings in the dark soil inside it that she checked every morning the way he checked the thermometer. Harlan's comment, when he saw the cold frame, was, "Agnes is going to want one of those." "Tell Agnes to ask Elena," Cole said. "She'll tell her exactly how." Harlan looked at him. "You seem different," he said. "I'm the same." "You're really not." Harlan tilted his head. "You whistled this morning." "I did not whistle." "I was standing 6 feet away, Cole. You whistled something. Sounded like it might have been a song at some point in its history." Cole picked up the hammer he'd been using and turned away to deal with the next thing on the list. "Go home, Harlan." Harlan went home grinning, which was becoming his default expression around Cole, which Cole chose to tolerate because Harlan had, over 11 years, earned a certain amount of tolerance. The answer from Tomasz arrived in May, 6 weeks after they'd sent the letter, fast for an international correspondence, which Elena said meant he'd replied the same day he'd received it. She read it alone in the kitchen in the early morning before Cole came down, and he found her there with the letter on the table and her expression, the particular one that meant she was holding something complicated together from the inside. "Good news?" he asked. She looked up. Yes, he's happy for me." She touched the letter. "He says—" She stopped, tried again. "He says he'd been afraid I was spending my whole life moving because I didn't trust anything to hold me. He says he's glad something held." Cole poured his coffee, sat down. "Is he right? That's what you were doing?" She was quiet for a moment. "Partly," she said. "I think partly I was moving because things genuinely couldn't hold me. The situations weren't right. The places weren't right. And partly," she looked at the letter, "partly it became a habit. Leaving before something could leave me first." He looked at her across the table. "What's different here?" She looked back at him steadily. "You didn't make it easy," she said. "You were difficult and quiet, and you had your own walls up higher than mine. And somehow that made it safer. Like, if someone that contained can be moved by something, then the something must be real." He sat with that for a moment. It was the most precisely she'd said it, and it landed with the particular force of a true thing precisely stated. "He wants to come," she said. "Not now. He can't leave now, but eventually. He wants to see the place." "He can come," Cole said. "There's room." She looked at him. "You'd have my brother living here." "For a while," he said, "if that's what's needed." She was quiet, and her face did the thing it did when she was trying not to show what she was feeling and not entirely succeeding. "You know," she said, "I used to think that people who said home easily were people who'd never had to find one the hard way, that the word came cheap to them." "And now?" he asked. "Now I think maybe it just takes longer for some of us," she said, "to find the place where the word means something." They were married in May, on a Saturday when the lilacs along the south fence, which Elena had discovered and tended back to life from a state of serious neglect, were in full bloom, small, as agreed. Harlan and Agnes, the Prentice family, Sarah Garrett and Thomas, Doc Tillman, Martha Holt and her husband, and Millie Voss, who had asked directly if she could attend and been told yes. Walt Greer performed it, which he did with the dignity of his former profession and fewer words than his council speeches, which was the right call. Thomas Garrett was almost unbearably serious about his role as the person who held the rings, a responsibility he had apparently been preparing for since he'd been told about it 2 weeks prior. He held them in his closed fist the entire ceremony and presented them with an expression of complete professional commitment, and afterward told anyone who would listen that he had not dropped them, not once, which was true and which he was right to be proud of. Elena wore a dress that was not the green one, a new one, blue-gray, that Martha Holt's daughter had helped her find fabric for, and Agnes had helped her make, which meant the dress had contributions from several women in it, which Cole thought was appropriate in a way he couldn't entirely articulate. She had her hair up properly, the way she'd worn it at the Grange gathering, and she looked, not like someone who had been transformed by the occasion, but like herself, fully herself, in a context where she'd finally stopped bracing for something to go wrong. He said his vows in the direct, unadorned way he said everything that mattered, and she said hers the same way. And when it was done, Millie Voss was the first to come forward, which surprised everyone, including Millie, who then compensated by being brisk about it. "You'll do well together," Millie told them, which was the closest she came to sentiment, and from her it carried the weight of a full eulogy. Summer came to Red Hollow with the ease of something that had been waiting patiently and was now simply arriving. The garden produced, not perfectly, there were things that didn't take, a row of carrots that went sideways, a section of beans that something got to before they could, but it produced enough that Elena was giving vegetables to Sarah Garrett by July and trading with Martha Holt for cheese. The fence held. The cold frame was already being planned for next year's seedlings. The house, which had spent years as the place Cole returned to at the end of the day, had become the place both of them came back to, which sounds like a small distinction and is not. Thomas Garrett spent half the summer in the yard, which his mother allowed because she knew where he was and because the baby was easier to manage without him, and which Cole allowed because Elena had said he was welcome, and what Elena said in the house was not debated. The boy had graduated from the bird notebook to a general observations notebook that also included weather measurements he took with a thermometer Cole had given him, because Cole had seen enough young people with good instincts get their instincts knocked out of them by a world that didn't value noticing, and he decided that was not going to happen to this particular 8-year-old if he could help it. Elena saw him giving Thomas the thermometer and didn't say anything until that evening. "That was generous," she said. "It was a spare one," he said. She looked at him with the look that meant she knew exactly what he was doing and was choosing not to call him on it because she approved. "He talks about you the way he talks about the buffalo he's planning to observe someday," she said. "Complete confidence that you're extraordinary." "I'm not extraordinary," Cole said. "I know," she said. "That's what makes you good at what you do." He didn't have an answer for that, which was fine. She didn't need one. The letter from Tomasz arrived again in August. Longer this time, with questions about the territory, about the cattle economy, about Cole specifically, which Elena answered with the same precision she brought to everything. She told Cole that her brother had found a better situation at home, that some things had shifted slightly in the political landscape, that he was cautiously more hopeful than he'd been in years. "He says," she told Cole one evening, reading from the letter, "that he wants me to know he's glad I stopped running." "What did you write back?" he asked. She set the letter down. "I wrote that I didn't stop running. I found somewhere worth stopping for." She looked at him. There's a difference. There was. He understood it. The distinction between giving up motion and finding the thing that makes motion unnecessary. He'd done it himself 11 years ago in a different way, when he'd pinned on a badge in a frontier town and decided this was where his particular combination of skills could do something real. It wasn't giving up, it was arriving. They were, in the end, two people who had arrived at the same place from different directions, each carrying the weight of everything it had taken to get there. And that weight was not gone, would not go, was part of what they were. Cole still went quiet for days and had to be asked what he was thinking. Elena still folded things away quickly when someone walked in on a private moment. The house was not always easy. Two stubborn people rarely achieve easy, and there were nights when they went to bed having said something that needed to be unsaid or hadn't said something that needed to come out, and they worked through it the next day with the same practical, direct approach they applied to frozen pipes in bad weather. That was the truth of it. Not simple, not solved, just ongoing, in the way that real things are ongoing, requiring attention and maintenance and the willingness to keep showing up even when showing up was difficult. But on a late August evening, sitting on the porch in the last of the summer light, Cole watching the yard and Elena reading a letter, and the sound of Thomas's voice somewhere in the barn where he'd been investigating something he'd declined to specify. On that evening, in that particular ordinary moment, what Red Hollow had become was visible. The house that had stood empty for years was lit from inside. The garden along the south fence had given everything it had that summer and was already being planned for next. 3 families had borrowed Elena's cold frame design and built their own. Danny Kohler, the 14-year-old who had been alone in a blizzard field at 4 a.m, had come to Cole 3 months ago and asked if he could learn the law. And Cole had said yes, which was how Red Hollow had acquired an unofficial apprentice deputy who was tall, fearless, and learning fast. None of it was elegant. None of it had gone according to plan because there had not been a plan. Just a want ad, and a train that was 40 minutes late, and a woman who stepped onto a platform and decided to endure. None of it was the kind of thing that gets made into a monument or remembered by people who weren't there. It was just a life. Two lives, interlocked, set in a piece of rough country that asked a great deal of the people who chose it and offered something in return that was hard to name and harder to leave. "You're quiet," Elena said, not looking up from her letter. "Thinking," he said. "About what?" He looked at the yard. At the fence he'd built? At the garden she'd grown? At the house behind them that was, for the first time since he'd owned it, entirely inhabited? "About the winter," he said. "About how different things were in November." She set down her letter, looked out at the same yard. "Different how?" "Quieter," he said. "Emptier." He paused. "Less." She was quiet for a moment. "Are you saying I improved the property value?" "I'm saying," he said, "that the ad I put in the paper was the best decision I've made in 11 years of making decisions in this town." She looked at him sideways. "That's the most romantic thing you've ever said to me." "I told you I wasn't a romantic man." "You told me you were a plain-spoken man," she said. "Sometimes those are the same thing." He looked at her. She looked back. The light was going over the western ridge, and the air was warm, and somewhere in the barn, Thomas had found whatever he was looking for and gone quiet, which was either good or concerning. "We should probably check on him," Cole said. "Probably," Elena agreed. Neither of them moved for another moment. Then she folded her letter and stood up, and he stood up beside her, and they went inside together through the door of a house that had learned over one long Montana winter what it was supposed to be. Not just a structure against the cold, but the kind of place that a person, or two people, could actually build something from. The kind of place where the warmth was not just in the walls, but in the fact of being there at all, together, with all the difficulty and imperfection that came with it. That was enough. More than enough. It was by any honest measure, everything.